A massive thank you to Dogface680 and so many others who suggested this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep this channel going. If you have suggestions for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. Now, let's dive into one of the most chilling government experiments you've never heard of. Some secrets don't get buried, they get frozen. In March 2004, something happened inside a sealed laboratory at Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico. The official record says nothing. The budget documentation lists a single line item: Applied Chronophysics Integration. The project lead, a brilliant Air Force physicist named David Lewis Anderson, walked into a temporal containment field for a routine 10-minute test. That was 21 years ago. For Anderson, those 10 minutes still haven't ended. This is the story of how the United States military accidentally trapped a man in time and why they might never be able to bring him back. March 1999, Rome, New York. The Air Force Research Laboratory at Griffiths Air Force Base didn't look like the kind of place where reality could be rewritten. Low brick buildings, chain-link fences, security badges that beeped at turnstiles. It was the kind of facility that processed grants for satellite communication upgrades and radar improvements. The unglamorous backbone of military research. David Lewis Anderson worked in Building 7, 3rd floor, in an office that smelled like burnt coffee and ozone. At 32, he was one of the youngest civilian physicists on the USAF Time-Related Research Program, a division so obscure that most airmen on the base didn't know it existed. Anderson's specialty was electromagnetic field manipulation, specifically how rotating magnetic fields affected subatomic particles in ways that classical physics couldn't quite explain. He'd noticed something strange during a routine particle confinement experiment. Decay rates inside his toroidal field chamber were slightly slower than they should have been. Not by much, a fraction of a microsecond. But it was measurable, repeatable, and according to Einstein's theory of relativity, it meant one thing: time inside the field was moving slower than time outside it. Anderson had stumbled onto this discovery almost by accident. He'd been running experiments on particle containment for the better part of 2 years, trying to develop more efficient methods for stabilizing unstable isotopes. The military applications were obvious. If you could slow radioactive decay, you could store nuclear materials more safely, transport them more easily, extend their operational lifespan. But what Anderson found was far more profound. He'd been using cesium-137, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of about 30 years, as his test subject. Standard procedure was to measure the decay rate both inside and outside the containment field to ensure the field wasn't interfering with the isotope's stability, except the decay rate inside the field was consistently slower. At first, Anderson thought it was measurement error. He recalibrated his instruments. He ran the test again and again. The results were identical every time. The cesium inside the field was decaying more slowly than it should. Not dramatically, we're talking fractions of microseconds, but consistently, measurably slower. Anderson knew what this meant. Radioactive decay is one of the most consistent processes in nature, a fundamental clock that ticks at the same rate regardless of temperature, pressure, or chemical environment. The only thing that can change decay rates is time itself. He spent 3 weeks reviewing the data, checking for every possible alternative explanation. He consulted with colleagues, carefully avoiding any mention of his hypothesis. He reviewed every paper ever published on time dilation, from Einstein's original work to the most recent experiments with atomic clocks. Finally, he was certain he'd created a temporal distortion field. On March 17th, 1999, Anderson filed an internal white paper with the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. The title was dry, academic, deliberately understated: Preliminary Model for Controlled Temporal Fields in Particle Confinement. Inside, the implications were staggering. Anderson theorized that by rotating electromagnetic fields at precise frequencies, it might be possible to create a localized distortion in space-time, a bubble where time moved at a different rate than the surrounding environment. Not time travel exactly, time dilation. a pocket of slow time. The mechanism, he explained, was related to frame-dragging effects predicted by general relativity. When massive objects rotate, they drag space-time along with them. Earth does this. It's called the lens-throwing effect. But the distortion is minuscule, barely measurable even with the most sensitive instruments. But what if you could amplify that effect? What if, instead of rotating mass, you rotated electromagnetic fields at enormous intensities? The math suggested it was possible. The experimental data suggested he'd already done it. The paper was 17 pages long. It included equations, experimental data, and a cautious conclusion. Further research recommended to determine scalability and practical applications. Anderson submitted the paper on a Wednesday afternoon. By Friday morning, his lab was swarming with visitors. They didn't identify themselves by name, just by agency. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, National Security Agency, a civilian liaison from the Department of Energy. They asked questions. They reviewed his data. They examined his equipment with the kind of intensity that made Anderson deeply uncomfortable. 3 months later, Anderson's lab was shut down. The official explanation was budget reallocation. His funding, roughly $2 million annually, was transferred to a classified DARPA project called the Quantum Waveform Defense Initiative. Anderson was told his research would continue under the new program, just in a different capacity. He was also told not to publish his findings. The meeting where they delivered the news took place in a windowless conference room on base. There were 4 people present: Anderson, his supervisor, and 2 men in dark suits who never gave their names. One of them slid a document across the table, a non-disclosure agreement. 23 pages of legal language that boiled down to this: everything Anderson had discovered about time dilation was now classified. Talking about it publicly would be a federal crime. Publishing it would be treason. Anderson had spent his entire career in pursuit of scientific knowledge. The idea that his greatest discovery would be locked away, hidden from the world, was devastating. But he signed the agreement. What choice did he have? In July 1999, Anderson left the Air Force. He moved to Long Island and founded the Anderson Institute, a private research organisation dedicated to what he called time control research for humanitarian use. The website featured photos of sleek laboratories and optimistic descriptions of future applications: medical stasis, space travel, advanced computing. What the website didn't mention was that Anderson's Air Force security clearance remained active for another 6 years, or that he'd signed a non-disclosure agreement with the Department of Defense that classified his research under the same legal framework used for nuclear weapons development, or that his departure from the Air Force wasn't really a departure at all. 2001 to 2003, Long Island, New York. The Anderson Institute operated out of a converted industrial building in Hopogue, a suburb 40 miles east of Manhattan. From the outside, it looked like any other tech startup. Glass doors, modernist furniture, a receptionist who smiled and asked visitors to sign in. Inside, Anderson was building something extraordinary. He called it the T3 time field generator. The device was deceptively simple in concept. A toroidal magnetic coil, about the size of a washing machine, capable of generating rotating electromagnetic fields at frequencies precise to the nanosecond. Suspended in the centre of the coil was a vacuum chamber where test subjects, particles, molecules, eventually small objects, could be placed. The goal was to create a measurable time differential. If successful, a clock inside the field would tick slower than a clock outside it. Anderson's funding came from a mix of private investors and anonymous grants. He suspected, correctly, that at least some of the money was coming from government sources, filtered through shell companies and defence contractors. But he didn't ask questions. The work was too important. The first prototype was completed in March 2001. It was crude, cobbled together from salvaged equipment and commercial components. The magnetic coils were wrapped by hand. The control systems were jury-rigged from laboratory surplus, but it worked. The first test was conducted on March 23, 2001, at 3:47 a.m. Anderson had been working for 36 hours straight, fueled by coffee and the kind of manic energy that comes from being on the verge of a breakthrough. He placed a quartz clock inside the vacuum chamber. Simple, mechanical, the kind of clock you could buy at any department store. Outside the chamber, he placed an identical clock, synchronized to the nanosecond using a GPS time signal. Then he activated the field. For the first 30 seconds, nothing happened. The coils hummed. The chamber vibrated slightly. Anderson watched the clocks, waiting. Then he noticed it. The clock inside the chamber was running slow, just barely but visibly. A second would pass on the external clock, and the internal clock would advance only by 0.999997 seconds. 3 microseconds of dilation per second. Doesn't sound like much. 3 millionths of a second. But in the world of experimental physics, it was groundbreaking. Proof that time could be manipulated, controlled, slowed. Anderson ran the test again, and again. The results were consistent. Over the next 2 years, he refined the design. Larger coils, more powerful magnets, better control systems. By late 2002, he'd achieved dilation rates of up to 10 microseconds per second. The T3 could slow time by 1%. He published a brief paper in an obscure physics journal. The reaction from the scientific community was muted, skeptical. Time dilation had been observed before, in particle accelerators, in atomic clocks on airplanes, but always as a byproduct of extreme speed or gravity. Anderson was claiming he could do it with stationary electromagnetic fields. Most physicists dismissed it as experimental error. A few expressed polite interest. None of them took it seriously, but not everyone was skeptical. In 2002, DARPA released a roadmap document titled Quantum Information Science and Technology, Strategic Vision and Research Plan. Buried on page 87, under a section labelled Areas of Strategic Interest, was a single line. Localized temporal phase anomalies. No explanation, no context, just those 4 words. Anderson saw the document and knew immediately what it meant. The military was interested in his work. They were pursuing it, probably through multiple channels, funding research at universities and national labs under innocuous-sounding program names. He wasn't the only one working on time control. He was just the only one doing it publicly. In September 2002, Anderson was invited to present his work at a small physics symposium in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The venue was a hotel conference room, the kind of place usually reserved for corporate training seminars. The audience was fewer than 30 people, mostly academics and a handful of government observers who sat in the back row and didn't ask questions. Anderson's presentation was cautious, technical. He showed data. He explained the theory. He suggested potential applications, space travel where astronauts could age more slowly, computational systems that could process information faster than normal time, medical stasis for patients awaiting treatment. He didn't mention the military applications, but everyone in the room was thinking about them. One man in the audience took detailed notes, careful, methodical notes filling page after page of a leather-bound notebook. Lieutenant Colonel James A. Ransone, a liaison for the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory Directed Energy Division. Ransone had a background in advanced weapons systems, lasers, microwave emitters, particle beams. He understood the potential of Anderson's work better than most of the civilians in the room. A time dilation field wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a weapon, a tool, a way to tilt the battlefield in ways that no enemy could counter. After the presentation, Ransone introduced himself. He was polite, professional, careful not to seem too eager. He congratulated Anderson on his work. He asked a few technical questions, the kind that demonstrated genuine understanding. 3 weeks later, Anderson received a phone call. Ransone was calling from Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. He got straight to the point. The Air Force was interested in exploring potential defense applications of Anderson's research. They wanted to fund a full-scale demonstration. State-of-the-art equipment, unlimited budget, access to the best physicists in the country. Anderson hesitated. He'd left the Air Force to pursue independent research, to avoid the secrecy and restrictions of military projects. But Ransone made an offer he couldn't refuse. Not just funding, recognition. If the experiment succeeded, Anderson's name would be attached to one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs in history. The man who proved that time could be controlled. There was also an implicit threat, though Ransone never stated it directly. Anderson's research was already classified. The non-disclosure agreement he'd signed in 1999 was still active. If he refused to cooperate, the government could shut down his institute, seize his equipment, and bury his work under classification orders. He could cooperate, or he could be silenced. In December 2002, Anderson signed a contract with the Department of Defense. He told himself he was doing it for science, for the chance to pursue his research at a scale that would have been impossible otherwise. But deep down, he knew the truth. He'd never really left the Air Force. He'd just been working off-site. 2004, Sandia National Laboratories, New Mexico. Sandia. National Laboratories sits on the edge of Albuquerque, a sprawling complex of buildings and bunkers tucked into the desert foothills. It's one of 3 labs in the United States responsible for maintaining the nuclear stockpile, a place where the cutting edge of physics meets the blunt reality of weapons development. Anderson arrived in January 2004. The project had a name now, Kronos. The acronym stood for something bureaucratic and forgettable, Kinetic Resonance Observation and Neutralization Operation System, but everyone involved knew what it really meant. Kronos, the Greek god of time, the titan who devoured his children. The symbolism wasn't lost on Anderson. Time devours everything eventually. But what if you could slow it down? What if you could make a single moment last forever? The goal was simple: build a scalable temporal containment field, something larger than Anderson's original prototype, something that could hold not just particles but objects, eventually maybe even people. The official justification was national security. Temporal stasis field could revolutionize warfare, freeze enemy munitions in mid-flight, store unstable isotopes indefinitely, create unbreakable communication delays that would make code breaking impossible. But Anderson knew the real reason the military was interested. If you could slow time, you could speed up everything else. A soldier in a time-dilated field could train for months while only hours passed in the outside world. A weapons lab could run decades of research in a fraction of the time. An intelligence agency could interrogate prisoners for years without anyone noticing they'd been gone. The ethical implications were staggering. Anderson tried not to think about them. The lab was located in Building 6580, a reinforced concrete structure with no windows and 3 layers of security clearance. The building was technically part of Sandia's Z-Machine complex, the facility that housed the most powerful X-ray generator on Earth. But Building 6580 existed in a kind of bureaucratic limbo, not listed on official maps, accessed through a separate gate that required special authorization. The equipment was the best Anderson had ever worked with. Superconducting magnets capable of generating fields measured in tens of Tesla. Precision atomic clocks accurate to 1 second in 300 million years. Quantum sensors capable of detecting fluctuations in space-time down to the Planck scale. The smallest measurable unit of distance in the universe. The team was small: Anderson, 2 Air Force physicists named Chen and Rodriguez, a handful of engineers, and Lieutenant Colonel Ransone, who observed every test with the quiet intensity of a man who knew this project could change the world. There were also observers, men and women who never gave their names, who sat in a separate control room behind reinforced glass and watched everything through cameras. Anderson assumed they were intelligence analysts, or maybe military strategists trying to figure out how to weaponize his discovery. He tried not to think about them either. The new design was based on Anderson's T3 prototype, but scaled up dramatically. The magnetic coils were arranged in a nested toroidal configuration, creating a containment field that was both more stable and more powerful. The control systems used quantum computers to adjust the field parameters in real time, compensating for fluctuations and maintaining coherence. The containment chamber itself was a cylinder, about 8 feet in diameter and 10 feet tall, large enough to hold equipment, instruments, eventually a person. The first test was scheduled for early March. They started small. A simple atomic clock placed inside the chamber and monitored for temporal anomalies. The field was activated for 5 minutes, running at low power. The clock fell behind by half a second. The second test ran for 10 minutes at higher power. The clock fell behind by 3 seconds. The third test ran for 15 minutes at maximum power. The clock fell behind by 22 seconds. The field was working. Not just working, exceeding expectations. The dilation rates were far higher than anything Anderson had achieved in his Long Island lab. But there was a problem. The field was stable, too stable. Once activated, it showed no signs of decay or degradation. The magnetic coils spun at precise frequencies. The energy levels remained constant. The space-time distortion held steady. In theory, that was good. A stable field meant predictable, controllable time dilation. But it also meant the field didn't want to shut down. The engineers had to manually collapse the magnetic fields, forcing the system offline. And each time they did, the instruments detected strange fluctuations, brief spikes in radiation, gravitational anomalies, distortions in the local electromagnetic field. Anderson compared it to popping a soap bubble. The bubble is stable as long as the surface tension holds, but when it breaks, the energy has to go somewhere. Rodriguez, one of the Air Force physicists, ran simulations. The results were troubling. If a large-scale temporal field collapsed suddenly, especially one containing a significant mass, the energy release could be catastrophic. Not nuclear bomb catastrophic, but enough to cause serious damage. And if something living were inside the field at the moment of collapse? Rodriguez didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The team decided to proceed with extreme caution. The next test would be longer, more ambitious. They would activate the field for 30 minutes and monitor it continuously, gathering data on stability, coherence, and energy consumption. The test was designated Cycle 11C. It was scheduled for March 12, 2004. March 12, 2004, 2:06 p.m. Mountain Time. Anderson stood in the control room watching the technicians make final preparations. The containment chamber sat in the centre of the lab, surrounded by diagnostic equipment and safety barriers. The magnetic coils were already humming, running through their pre-activation sequence. Inside the chamber, they'd placed an array of instruments: atomic clocks, radiation detectors, temperature sensors, cameras, everything they'd need to monitor conditions inside the field. Ransone stood beside Anderson, arms crossed, watching the same scene through the reinforced glass. "This is it," Ransone said quietly. "If this test succeeds, we move to Phase 2. "Which is?" Anderson asked, though he already knew the answer. "Human testing." Anderson felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd always known it would come to this. You couldn't revolutionize warfare, or medicine, or space travel, or any of the other applications, without eventually putting a person inside the field. But the idea still made him uneasy. "We'll need to run more tests first," Anderson said. "Animals, at least. Mice, then something larger. We need to understand the biological effects." "We understand enough," Ransone interrupted. "The field doesn't affect matter directly. It affects time, and biology operates on the same time as everything else. If the field is safe for a clock, it's safe for a person," Anderson wanted to argue. But the logic was sound, even if the conclusion made him uncomfortable. At 2 p.m, the final checks were complete. Rodriguez gave the signal. The technicians cleared the lab, retreating behind safety barriers. At 2:06 p.m. and 27 seconds, Anderson pressed the activation button. The magnetic coils spun up to full power. The air inside the chamber shimmered, distorting like heat waves rising off the asphalt. The instruments registered the familiar signatures of temporal distortion, gravitational anomalies, electromagnetic fluctuations, a subtle warping of space itself. The atomic clocks inside the chamber began to fall behind. For the first 5 minutes, everything proceeded normally. The field held steady. The instruments transmitted data continuously. The dilation rate stabilized at approximately 4.2%, meaning time inside the field was passing about 4.2% slower than outside. At 2:15 p.m, something changed. The dilation rate increased. Not by much, just a few tenths of a percent, but it was unexpected. The field was supposed to be stable. Anderson checked the control systems. Everything was normal. The magnetic coils were operating within parameters. The energy levels were steady, but the dilation rate kept climbing. 4.5%, 4.8%, 5.1%. What's happening? Ransone asked. I don't know, Anderson admitted. The field's stabilising at a higher dilation rate than we calculated. Is that a problem? Anderson didn't answer immediately. He was running calculations in his head, comparing the observed data to the theoretical predictions. It shouldn't be, he said finally. The field's still coherent. It's just stronger than expected. By 2:30 p.m, the dilation rate had stabilised at 6.7%. The atomic clocks inside the chamber were now falling behind by about 4 seconds every minute, which meant that for every hour that passed outside the chamber, only about 56 minutes passed inside. The test was supposed to run for 30 minutes of external time. Inside the chamber, that would be about 28 minutes. But Anderson made a decision. He decided to enter the chamber himself. It wasn't planned. Ransone objected immediately. The engineers protested, but Anderson was adamant. We need to know what it's like inside, he said. I'll go in for 10 minutes. That's less than 9.5 minutes for me. I'll observe, take notes, and come right back out. This is insane, Rodriguez said. We haven't tested this on anything living. I'll be fine, Anderson insisted. The field doesn't cause physical harm. It just slows time. I won't even feel it. Ransone considered for a long moment. Then he nodded. 10 minutes, he said. External time. We shut down the field at 2:47 p.m. exactly, whether you're ready or not. Anderson agreed. He entered the containment chamber at 2:37 p.m. From Anderson's perspective, entering the chamber was unremarkable. The air felt normal, the temperature was comfortable, the lighting was slightly dim, but that was just the design of the chamber. He could hear the hum of the magnetic coils, a deep thrumming sound that resonated in his chest, but it wasn't unpleasant. He checked his watch. 2:37 p.m. The plan was simple. Stay inside for 10 minutes, observe conditions, document everything, then exit and report his findings. Anderson walked around the interior of the chamber examining the instruments. The atomic clocks were running normally. From his perspective, he knew they were falling behind the external clocks, but he couldn't perceive the difference. Time felt normal. He spoke into a digital voice recorder documenting his observations. 2:38 p.m, internal conditions nominal. No discomfort, no unusual sensations. Temperature approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Lighting adequate. Acoustic environment normal apart from the magnetic coil hum. He checked the instruments. Radiation levels normal. Electromagnetic field strength within expected parameters. 2:40 p.m. All systems appear stable. No adverse effects observed. Subjective experience of time appears normal, which is consistent with relativity theory. From my reference frame, time is passing at the normal rate. The dilation is only apparent from an external frame. He continued his observations, checking instruments, taking measurements, speaking into the recorder. 2:43 p.m. Midpoint of observation period. Continuing to feel normal. No dizziness, nausea or disorientation. Cognitive function appears unaffected. He glanced at his watch again. 2:44 p.m. 6 minutes had passed for him. Outside, it would be close to 6.5 minutes, maybe 7 given the increased dilation rate. He had about 4 more minutes to go. Anderson decided to conduct a simple cognitive test. He recited the first 50 digits of pi from memory, then performed several mental arithmetic calculations. Everything seemed normal. His mind was sharp, his thoughts clear. 2:46 p.m. cognitive function test complete. No deficits detected, preparing to exit. He stopped mid-sentence. Something was wrong. Not with him, with the field. He could feel it now. A subtle change in the air pressure, a slight increase in the magnetic field intensity. The hum of the coils was getting louder, deeper. Anderson looked at the instruments. The electromagnetic field strength was increasing, not dramatically but measurably. Outside, he knew the technicians would be seeing the same data. They'd be debating whether to shut down the field early. He checked his watch. 2:47 p.m, time to exit. He walked to the chamber door and reached for the handle. It didn't move. Anderson tried again, pulling harder. The door was sealed tight. He spoke into the recorder, trying to keep his voice calm. 2:47 p.m. Door appears to be sealed. Possibly a safety interlock. We'll wait for technicians to open from outside. He waited. 1 minute passed, then 2. His watch read 2:49 p.m. For him, 12 minutes had elapsed since he'd entered the chamber. But outside, if his calculations were correct, it would be close to 2:50 p.m, 13 minutes of external time. They should have opened the door by now. Anderson felt the first flicker of concern. Outside the chamber, panic was setting in. At 2:47 p.m, as planned, the technicians began the shutdown sequence. They reduced power to the magnetic coils, initiating the controlled collapse of the temporal field. But the field didn't collapse. The dilation rate decreased slightly, dropping from 6.7% to about 6.5%. But the field remained stable, coherent, active. "It's not shutting down," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with stress. Ransone leaned over the control console. "Why not?" "I don't know. The magnetic field should be decaying, but they're holding steady. It's like the field has achieved some kind of equilibrium state. It's self-sustaining." Anderson, inside the chamber, was still visible on the video monitors. He was standing by the door, clearly trying to exit. Ransone made a decision. Open the door manually, emergency override. The technicians tried. The door was magnetically sealed, designed to maintain the integrity of the containment environment. The override should have released it, but it didn't work. "The magnetic field is interfering with the locking mechanism," one engineer reported. "We can't open it while the field is active." "Then collapse the field," Ransone ordered. "We're trying, sir." "It's not responding." Inside the chamber, Anderson had figured out what was happening. The field had stabilized at a higher energy state than expected, and now it was trapped in that state. Shutting it down would require more than just reducing power to the coils. It would require a complete reconfiguration of the system, possibly even a forced magnetic collapse. But that would be dangerous. A sudden collapse could create a temporal shear, a violent reintegration of the time differential. Inside the chamber, where time was passing 6.5% slower, Anderson would experience the collapse as a sudden acceleration. His body would be forced to catch up with external time in an instant. The energy release would be catastrophic. Rodriguez was running the same calculations. His face had gone pale. "If we force the collapse," he said quietly, "the temporal shear could kill him." Ransone stared at the monitor, watching Anderson pace inside the chamber. "What are our options?" "We keep the field running," Rodriguez said. "Maintain it indefinitely until we can figure out a way to safely bring it down." "How long?" "I don't know. Days, weeks, maybe longer." Inside the chamber, Anderson checked his watch. 2:53 p.m. For him, 16 minutes had passed. Outside, it was approximately 2:54 p.m., 17 minutes. He'd expected to be out by now. The test should have been over, but the door was still sealed and he could hear the coils still humming. Something had gone wrong. Over the next several hours, external time, the team at Sandia tried everything. They attempted to gradually reduce the field strength, hoping to slowly bring the dilation rate down to 0. But every time they adjusted the power, the field compensated, maintaining its equilibrium. They tried to override the door locks mechanically, using hydraulic tools to force it open, but the magnetic field was too strong, interfering with the mechanisms. They even considered cutting through the chamber walls with plasma torches, but the chamber was designed to contain radiation and electromagnetic fields. The walls were reinforced with layers of new metal and lead. Cutting through them would take days, and all the while Anderson was inside, unaware of the crisis unfolding around him. From his perspective, only about 90 minutes had passed. He'd tried the door periodically, spoken into his recorder, documented his situation. He was concerned but not panicked. He assumed the delay was technical, that the team was working on the problem. He had no idea they couldn't get him out. By 8 p.m. external time, about 7:30 p.m. for Anderson, the situation was clear. The field wasn't going to collapse naturally. It would continue running indefinitely, or until the power supply failed, and forcing it to collapse would kill Anderson. Ransoni convened an emergency meeting with the project leads. Anderson was still visible on the monitors, sitting inside the chamber, reading a technical manual he'd found on a shelf. "We have 3 options," Rodriguez said. 1. We keep the field running indefinitely and hope we eventually figure out how to safely collapse it. 2. We cut power to the facility, which will force an immediate collapse and almost certainly kill Anderson. 3. We seal the chamber permanently and leave him in there. The room was silent. "Option 3 isn't an option," Ranson said firmly. "We're not abandoning him." "Then we go with option 1, Rodriguez replied. "We maintain the field, we keep monitoring, and we research. Maybe we'll find a solution." It was decided. The field would continue running. The chamber would be sealed, not permanently but securely to prevent accidental interference. The entire module would be classified at the highest level, and research would continue in secret. They would find a way to save Anderson. They had to. But weeks passed, then months, and the field remained stable, unyielding. Inside the chamber, Anderson's watch showed that only about 6 hours had passed. He was confused, frustrated, but still hopeful. He assumed the delay was temporary, that the team was working on a solution. He had no way of knowing that outside the world was moving on without him. August 2005. The Anderson Institute's website went dark on August 14th, 2005. There was no announcement, no explanation. One day the site was live. Photos of laboratories, press releases, contact information. The next day, it was gone. Replaced by a blank page with a single line of text. Experiments currently suspended for government collaboration. Anderson's colleagues were given minimal information. They were told he'd taken a long-term consulting position with the government, working on classified projects at an undisclosed location. They were asked politely but firmly not to discuss the nature of his work. Most accepted the explanation. A few were suspicious. One engineer, Thomas Keller, couldn't let it go. He'd worked with Anderson for 3 years, building the T3 prototype, refining the designs. They'd been friends. And now Anderson had vanished without a word, without even a goodbye. Keller sent emails, they bounced back. He tried calling, the numbers were disconnected. Finally, in September 2005, Keller drove to Sandia National Laboratories. He showed up at the main gate, asked to speak with Anderson, said it was urgent. Security escorted him off the property. 2 weeks later, Keller received a visit from 2 men in dark suits. They identified themselves as Department of Defense investigators. They asked him about his relationship with Anderson. They asked if he'd shared any information about the time dilation experiments. They reminded him that violating a federal non-disclosure agreement carried a prison sentence of up to 10 years. Keller never spoke about Anderson again. Meanwhile, at Sandia, the sealed chamber sat in building 6580, humming quietly, ignored by everyone except a handful of technicians who monitored it remotely. Inside, Anderson had no idea that 18 months of external time had passed. For him, it was still March 12th, 2004. Only about 11 hours had elapsed since he'd entered the chamber. He'd stopped speaking into the recorder. He'd stopped trying the door. He'd settled into a kind of routine, sleeping, reading the technical manuals stored in the chamber, doing exercises to stay physically fit. He'd long since figured out that something had gone seriously wrong. But he also knew that panicking wouldn't help. The team outside would fix the problem. They had to. He just had to wait. 2010. The hacker collective called themselves Black Obelisk. They specialised in infiltrating government contractor networks, exploiting the weak security that often existed in the civilian companies that serviced classified projects. In March 2010, they hit Los Alamos National Laboratory, or rather, they hit a contractor that managed the lab's email servers. The cache they released was enormous, thousands of documents, most of them mundane, budget reports, personnel evaluations, equipment manifests. But buried in the archive was a PDF titled Temporal Field Integrity Log, Test Cycle 11C. The document detailed the March 2004 test at Sandia. It listed Anderson as the test subject, and it included a chilling line in the final entry. Subject remains in containment, field stable, extraction impossible without catastrophic temporal shear, recommend indefinite maintenance protocol. The internet exploded with speculation, forums filled with theories, but within 48 hours every copy of the document vanished. Websites were scrubbed, servers were seized. Black Obelisk went silent. The story faded into conspiracy theory territory, dismissed as an elaborate hoax. But a few copies survived, hidden in encrypted drives and dark web archives, and some people believed. 2022, Brooklyn, New York. Elena Warren was researching Cold War DARPA projects for a podcast when she stumbled across a reference to the Quantum Waveform Defense Initiative in a declassified memo. She filed FOIA requests. She tracked down Anderson's old patents. She found the Black Obelisk leak archived on an obscure server. Most importantly, she found a pattern. Equipment transfers from Sandia to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 2006. A sealed module labelled Kronos, do not open. She traced the module's current location. It was still there, in a sub-basement facility at Wright-Patterson, consuming electricity 24 hours a day. Still running. March 2023. Elena found Gary Holcomb, a retired Air Force technician who'd maintained the electrical systems at Sandia during the Kronos project. He was dying of cancer and he decided to talk. The field never shut down, Holcomb told her over coffee at a small Arizona diner. They couldn't collapse it without killing him, so they just kept it running, built a containment structure around it, moved the whole thing to Wright-Patterson. Is he still alive? Elena asked. Depends on how you define alive, Holcomb said. For us it's been 20 years. For him it's been maybe a day and a half at most. Can they ever bring him out? Holcomb shook his head slowly. The math doesn't work. The temporal differential is too large now. If they collapse the field, his body will try to sync with external time instantly. The energy release would be... He trailed off. They ran simulations. Every scenario ends the same way. Elena recorded everything. 2 hours of testimony. She titled the file chronology_Anderson final.wave. 2 weeks later, Holcomb died. Natural causes, the death certificate said. But when Elena checked her recording, something impossible had happened. The file's metadata showed a creation date of March 12th, 2004, 14:06:27. The same moment Anderson had entered the chamber. No outlet would publish her story. Legal departments cited national security concerns. Editors called it too risky. The investigation died, but Eleanor kept the files. October 2024. Late one night, the Anderson Institute's website came back online. The page was simple, black background, white text. Temporal field integrity, 100%. Containment status, holdings, March 12th, 2004, 14:06:27. Active. The timestamp didn't move. It stayed frozen at that exact moment. Someone examined the page's source code and found a hidden comment. For David Lewis Anderson, only 27 hours had passed since he entered the chamber. He was still inside, still alive, still waiting for someone to open the door and tell him the test was over. Outside, 21 years had gone by. The website stayed live for 3 days, then vanished. But screenshots circulated. The timestamp became an internet legend. Proof that somewhere in a sealed basement at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a man was trapped in a moment that would never end. The field continued to hum. The magnetic coils continued to spin, and time inside that chamber moved infinitely slower than the world outside. Time dilation is real. Einstein proved it. Astronauts age slower in space. Atomic clocks tick differently at different altitudes, but localized time dilation created by electromagnetic fields. The physics is theoretical, possible perhaps, but unproven, unless it has been proven, and the results are locked away behind classification orders that will never expire. If the military did succeed in creating a temporal containment field, if they did trap a man inside it, We would never know. The technology would be buried under the same legal protections as nuclear weapons. The researchers would be silenced, the evidence would disappear. And if someone were trapped inside, caught in a bubble of slow time that could never be safely collapsed, there would be no rescue, no happy ending. Just a man, waiting in a moment that never ends while the world outside moves on without him. Somewhere in the classified depths of a military facility, a timestamp blinks on a monitor. March 12th, 2004, 14:06:27, active. For David Lewis Anderson, the test is still running. It might run forever. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a thank you to Don Welsh for this incredible video suggestion. The Tetris conspiracy is one of those rabbit holes that just keeps getting deeper the more you dig. If you have ideas for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Trust me, after tonight's story you might need something to help you sleep. Now, let me tell you about the package that changed everything, and how a simple children's game became the key to understanding one of the Cold War's most carefully buried secrets. I never thought I'd be pulled into a Cold War ghost story. My life was ordinary. A freelance researcher with a small apartment, a dying houseplant, and a Netflix subscription that got more use than my gym membership. I wrote articles about obscure historical events for online magazines that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. But then the package arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier service I'd never heard of, Meridian Express. The driver was nervous, constantly checking his phone, and he made me sign 3 different forms before he'd hand over the manila envelope. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters across the front, Elena Vasquez, personal and confidential. Inside I found documents that shouldn't have existed. Soviet-era memos with Cyrillic letterheads, computer printouts from the 1980s, and scientific papers that looked like they'd been smuggled out of some classified archive. But it was the photograph that made my hand shake. A Polaroid, faded and slightly yellow around the edges. The image showed a group of men in thick sweaters standing around what looked like an early computer terminal. The setting was clearly academic. I could see chalkboards covered in equations in the background. But there, in the corner of the photo, was a little girl with pigtails playing with building blocks on the floor. The little girl was me, and the man kneeling beside me, showing me how to stack the coloured blocks, was someone I'd never seen before in my life. According to the handwritten note on the back of the photo, Vladimir Pokilko, Moscow Computer Center, 1987. The note at the bottom of the package explained everything and nothing at once. Eleanor, your father's work touched more lives than he ever knew. What happened to us was not an accident. The game was never just a game. You have his eyes, and more importantly, you have his mind. Be careful who you trust. The blocks are still falling. A friend. I sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes staring at that photograph. My father, Dr. Miguel Vasquez, had been a computer scientist who'd worked on early artificial intelligence research in the late 1980s. He'd died when I was 12, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. But I remembered him telling me stories about his work, about trips to conferences where brilliant minds from around the world shared their discoveries. One story in particular came flooding back. He'd told me about a simple game that had captured the imagination of everyone who played it. 7 shapes, falling from the sky, fitting together like pieces of an impossible puzzle. The most beautiful thing about mathematics, he'd said, is that even chaos follows patterns. That game proves it. He'd been talking about Tetris. I'd never connected those childhood stories to the global phenomenon Tetris became. But as I looked at that photograph, as I saw myself playing with blocks while Vladimir Pokhilko watched, I realised I hadn't stumbled into this mystery. I'd been born into it. The package wasn't a random delivery, it was an inheritance. And according to what I was about to discover, it was also a death sentence. The first thing I learned about Tetris was that everything I thought I knew was wrong. Most people believe the story goes like this. In 1984, a Russian programmer named Alexei Pajitnov created a simple puzzle game while working at the Moscow Academy of Sciences. The game was so addictive that it spread through the Soviet Union like wildfire, eventually making its way to the West, where it became one of the most successful video games of all time. A beautiful story of creativity triumphing over Cold War tensions, but my father's notebooks told a different story. I found them 3 days after receiving the package, hidden in a storage unit I'd inherited but never bothered to visit. Box after box of research papers, computer printouts, and handwritten journals that my father had apparently been keeping secret for years. The notebooks were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with mathematical formulas scattered throughout like some kind of academic code. The entry that changed everything was dated October 15th, 1987. The Moscow conference was more productive than expected. Met with Pokhilko's team today. Their work on pattern recognition is fascinating but disturbing. The game they've developed, they call it Tetris from the Greek tetra meaning 4, shows remarkable potential for cognitive conditioning. The subjects who play for extended periods exhibit measurable changes in brainwave patterns. Pokhilko believes they've accidentally created a form of technological hypnosis. The entry continued. Showed Elena the coloured blocks today while we were in Moscow. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't understand that she was playing with the building blocks of something that could reshape human consciousness. None of us did. We thought we were just studying games. We had no idea we were creating weapons. I read that passage 5 times before it sank in. My father hadn't just been a conference attendee in Moscow. He'd been part of the team that helped develop Tetris, and according to his notes, they'd discovered something that terrified them. The game was changing people's minds. The phenomenon was subtle at first. Players would report seeing the falling blocks when they closed their eyes. They'd dream about the game. They'd find themselves mentally rotating objects in daily life, trying to make them fit together like Tetris pieces. Researchers dubbed it the Tetris effect, and initially everyone thought it was harmless, just the brain's way of processing repetitive visual information. But my father's notes suggested something much more sinister. The Tetris effect wasn't just visual persistence, it was cognitive rewiring. Players were being conditioned to think in patterns, to seek order from chaos, to derive satisfaction from solving problems that had been specifically designed to trigger dopamine release. In other words, Tetris was a mind control experiment disguised as entertainment. My father's final entry about the Moscow project was dated November the 3rd, 1987. Had to leave the conference early. Pokhilko pulled me aside yesterday, said things were getting dangerous. The KGB has taken interest in our research. They don't see Tetris as a game. They see it as a tool for psychological manipulation. Military applications, civilian control. I'm bringing Elena home tomorrow. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue. That was the last mention of Tetris in my father's notebooks for over a decade, but I knew the story didn't end there. Because if it had, I never would have received that package. Someone wanted me to know what really happened to Tetris. More importantly, they wanted me to understand what had happened to the people who'd helped create it. And as I was about to discover, very few of those people were still alive. Robert Maxwell died on November 5th, 1991, but the circumstances of his death were so bizarre that conspiracy theorists are still debating them today. The media mogul and publisher was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands, having apparently fallen overboard from his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. Some called it suicide, others suspected murder. But almost nobody connected his death to a simple puzzle game. Almost nobody. Among my father's papers, I found a folder labelled Maxwell Correspondence 1990 to 1991. Inside were photocopies of letters that revealed a side of Robert Maxwell's business empire that had never made it into the history books. Maxwell hadn't just been interested in newspapers and publishing. He'd been deeply involved in the international licensing of Soviet software, including games. The letter that caught my attention was dated March 18th, 1991. Dear Dr. Vasquez, I hope this letter finds you well. As discussed during our meeting in London, I remain very interested in the psychological applications you and your Moscow colleagues discovered. The commercial success of the game has exceeded all projections, but I believe we've only scratched the surface of its potential. The pharmaceutical applications alone could be worth billions. Please reconsider your decision to withdraw from the project. Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. R. Maxwell. Pharmaceutical applications? I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what Maxwell could have meant. Then I found my father's reply, dated March 25th, 1991. Robert, I've made my position clear. The research we conducted in Moscow was preliminary and potentially dangerous. The cognitive effects we observed in test subjects were concerning enough to warrant ceasing all experiments. I will not be party to any attempt to weaponize this technology, regardless of the financial incentives involved. Please do not contact me about this matter again. Miguel Vasquez. But Maxwell did contact him again. The folder contained 7 more letters, each one increasingly desperate, increasingly threatening. Maxwell's final letter, dated October the 30th, 1991, just 6 days before his death, was the most chilling. Miguel, you're making a mistake that will cost both of us dearly. The people I represent are not patient. They invested heavily in this project based on the promise of the Moscow research. If you continue to refuse cooperation, I cannot guarantee your safety or that of your family. This is not a threat. It's a warning. There are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands. R.M. 6 days later, Robert Maxwell was dead. The official investigation concluded that Maxwell had either committed suicide or suffered an accidental fall from his yacht. But investigators found several unusual details that never made it into the public record. Maxwell's personal safe had been emptied before his death, and several £1 million had been transferred from his accounts to shell companies in Eastern Europe. More importantly, his yacht's security cameras had been mysteriously disabled during the exact time frame of his disappearance. I might have dismissed these coincidences if I hadn't found one more document in my father's files. A newspaper clipping from the London Times, dated November the 7th, 1991. Someone had highlighted a single paragraph buried deep in the article about Maxwell's death. Among Maxwell's personal effects recovered from the yacht were several computer disks labelled Project Tetris, and a notebook containing what appeared to be psychological research notes. These items have been turned over to British intelligence for investigation. Project Tetris. My father had never mentioned any project by that name, but the connection was obvious. Maxwell had been trying to commercialise the psychological effects that the Moscow team had discovered. He'd been working with people who had enough power and influence to make problems disappear permanently. And when Maxwell tried to back out, or perhaps demanded too much money, those same people had made him disappear too. The question that kept me awake at night was simple. If they were willing to kill Robert Maxwell, one of the most powerful media moguls in the world, what would they do to the researchers who'd actually created the technology? I was about to find out. Vladimir Pokhilko was supposed to be a success story. The co-creator of Tetris had emigrated to the United States in the 1990s and founded his own software company in Silicon Valley. He had the American dream within his grasp. A beautiful house in Palo Alto, a loving wife, 2 children, and the promise of financial success from his work on one of the world's most popular games. On September 22nd, 1998, police found Vladimir Pokhilko, his wife Elena, and their 12-year-old son Peter dead in their home. The official report concluded that Pochilko had murdered his family before taking his own life, driven to madness by financial pressures and the stress of a failing business. But the evidence never quite added up. Among the documents in the package I'd received was a police report that had supposedly been sealed. The details painted a picture that was much more complex and disturbing than the official story suggested. Pochilko had been found with multiple stab wounds, which was unusual for a suicide. His wife and son showed signs of struggle, but there was no evidence that Pochilko had been physically capable of overpowering both of them. Most importantly, neighbours reported seeing unfamiliar cars in the area during the days leading up to the deaths. But it was the contents of Pochilko's home office that revealed the truth. According to the police inventory, investigators found dozens of pages of handwritten notes in Russian, all apparently burned in the fireplace except for fragments that had escaped the flames. The few readable pieces contained references to psychological experiments, Moscow protocols, and behavioural modification through repetitive stimulus. One fragment preserved in the police file was particularly chilling. The game was never the goal. The game was the delivery mechanism. We created the perfect Trojan horse, entertainment that reprograms the mind through voluntary participation. But they want to weaponize it, to use it for purposes we never intended. I've tried to stop them, but... The note ended there, torn and partially burned. The package I'd received contained something the police had never seen. A recording of Vladimir Pochilko's last phone call, made just hours before his death. The audio quality was poor, full of static and background noise, but Pochilko's voice was unmistakable. He was speaking to someone who wasn't responding, perhaps leaving a voicemail message. If you're listening to this, it means they've found me. I've tried to warn everyone who was part of the original research, but most of them are already gone. Maxwell was just the beginning. They're systematically eliminating everyone who knows the truth about what we created. Static filled the recording for several seconds before Pochilko's voice returned, more urgent now. The game is still active, still spreading, still changing minds on a global scale. But that was never the plan. We thought we were creating entertainment. We didn't know we were creating a weapon. And now that weapon is being used against millions of people without their knowledge or consent. Another pause, then Pochilko's voice became almost whispered. Miguel Vasquez was smart to leave when he did. He saw where this was heading before the rest of us. If they come for me, tell him. Tell him the devil is in the code. The patterns aren't random. They never were. Each level, each piece placement, each reward mechanism, it's all designed to create specific neurological responses. We built a machine that learns how to manipulate human behaviour, and now we've lost control of it. The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence. I listened to that message a dozen times, and each time I felt a chill run down my spine. Vladimir Pochilko hadn't killed his family and himself. He'd been silenced because he was trying to expose the truth about Tetris, and in his final moments, he'd specifically mentioned my father's name. My father had known this was coming. That's why he'd left the Moscow project. That's why he'd hidden his research. And that's why he'd never told me the truth about what he'd been involved in. But someone had decided it was time for me to know. The question was, who had sent me the package and why were they willing to risk their life to get this information to me? The human brain is remarkably adaptable. Give it a repetitive task and it will quickly develop neural pathways to handle that task more efficiently. Show it patterns, and it will learn to recognise and predict those patterns. This neuroplasticity is usually considered a good thing. It's how we learn languages, develop skills, and adapt to new environments. But my father's research had discovered that this adaptability could be exploited. The notebook I'd found contained detailed studies of Tetris players, conducted over several months in 1987. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. After just 2 weeks of regular play, subjects showed measurable changes in brainwave patterns. After a month, they exhibited altered sleep cycles, with REM sleep dominated by geometric patterns and spatial processing dreams. After 3 months, the changes became permanent. Most concerning was what my father called the compliance correlation. Players who spent more than an hour per day playing Tetris showed increased susceptibility to authority figures and decreased critical thinking when faced with routine tasks. They became, in his words, more comfortable with imposed order and less likely to question systematic control. The implications were staggering. Tetris wasn't just addictive in the conventional sense. It was literally rewiring players' brains to be more compliant, more accepting of external control, more willing to find satisfaction in repetitive, meaningless tasks. It was the perfect tool for social conditioning. My father's notes from October 1987 revealed the moment when he realised what they had created. Observed Eleanor playing with the coloured blocks again today. She's become obsessed with making them fit together perfectly, just like the Tetris players in our study. But when I tried to get her to stop and help with dinner, she became agitated and insisted on finishing the pattern. This is exactly the behaviour we've documented in the test subjects, an inability to abandon incomplete geometric tasks, even when more important activities require attention. The realisation hit me like a physical blow. We haven't just created a game that changes how people think. We've created a game that makes people prioritise the game over everything else in their lives. And if that principle could be applied to other activities, other systems, other forms of control... I need to get Elena away from Moscow immediately. This research needs to be buried. But the research hadn't been buried. According to the documents in the package, it had been expanded. I found copies of scientific papers published in obscure Soviet journals throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The authors were always different, but the research methodology was identical to what my father had documented. Studies on geometric pattern recognition and behavioural modification, experiments in visual stimulus conditioning and compliance enhancement, theoretical frameworks for large-scale cognitive influence through interactive media. The most chilling paper was published in 1992, 3 years after my father had left the project. The title was innocuous: Applications of Repetitive Visual Stimulus in Educational Software Design. But the content described a systematic program to embed Tetris-like elements into everything from children's learning games to employee training programs. The authors had figured out how to weaponize the Tetris effect, and they were deploying it everywhere. I started paying attention to the games my friends played, the apps on their phones, the casual entertainment they consumed during breaks at work. The patterns were everywhere once I knew how to look for them. Falling objects that needed to be arranged, repetitive tasks that provided small rewards at regular intervals, visual stimuli designed to trigger the same neurological responses that my father's team had first documented in Moscow. We weren't just playing games, we were being programmed. The most disturbing part was how voluntary it all seemed. Nobody was forcing people to play these games. In fact, people paid money for the privilege of having their minds reshaped. They carried the programming devices in their pockets, installed the conditioning software on their home computers, and spent hours each day voluntarily submitting to psychological manipulation. And they enjoyed it. My father had tried to stop this from happening, but he'd been just one researcher against a system that had recognised the incredible potential of what they'd discovered. The people behind Project Tetris hadn't just created a game, they'd created a blueprint for controlling human behaviour on a global scale. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. If the technology was so powerful and so widespread, why were the original researchers being killed? Why not just buy their silence with money and success? The answer, I realised, was simple. The researchers knew too much about how the system worked, and more importantly, they knew how to turn it off. Death has a way of following certain kinds of knowledge. The deeper I dug into the history of Tetris and its creators, the more bodies I found scattered across 3 decades. It started with the obvious cases, Robert Maxwell and Vladimir Pokhilko, but the pattern extended far beyond the famous names. Dr. Alexei Gerasimov, one of the original Moscow researchers, died in a car accident in 1994. Professor Marina Volkov, who had studied the psychological effects of geometric puzzles, succumbed to a sudden illness in 1996. Viktor Briabrin, who helped program the first version of Tetris, was found dead in his apartment from an apparent gas leak in 2001. Each death had a plausible explanation. Car accidents happen, people get sick, gas leaks occur. But when I mapped out the timeline and cross-referenced it with the documents in the package, a clear pattern emerged. Everyone who had intimate knowledge of the psychological research behind Tetris was dying at a rate that defied statistical probability. The folder labelled Casualty Report contained obituaries, newspaper clippings and death certificates for 47 individuals connected to the original Moscow project or its subsequent developments. 47 people, dead over the course of 20 years, with an average age of death significantly lower than the general population. But it was the method of elimination that revealed the true sophistication of whoever was behind this. No obvious assassinations, no suspicious murders that would attract media attention. Just a steady stream of accidents, illnesses and suicides that could be explained away individually but formed an unmistakable pattern when viewed collectively. My father had been scheduled to die in 1999, according to a handwritten list I found tucked into one of the folders. His name was crossed out with a note: Natural causes, heart attack 1991. No further action required. He'd escaped the systematic elimination by dying of natural causes before they could get to him. The irony was bitter. My father's weak heart had probably saved his life by ending it, before his knowledge became too dangerous to ignore. But I was still alive, and according to the documents, I'd inherited not just my father's research, but also his place on their list. The package had been sent to me by someone who signed themselves only as Deep Throat, an obvious reference to the Watergate informant. But their identity wasn't as important as their warning. Elena, by now you understand what your father was involved in. What you may not realise is that the project never ended. Tetris was just the beginning. The technology has evolved, been refined and deployed on a scale your father never could have imagined. Every social media app, every casual game, every productivity program contains elements of the original Moscow research. Humanity is being systematically conditioned for compliance, and most people don't even realise it's happening. The original researchers are being eliminated not because they might expose the project, but because they know how to reverse its effects. Your father's notebooks contain algorithms that could potentially deprogram the conditioning, but only if someone with the right knowledge could implement them. That's why they want you dead. Not for what you know, but for what you might be able to do with what you know. You have a choice to make. You can destroy the research, disappear, and hope they leave you alone. Or you can finish what your father started and try to give humanity back its free will. But understand this. Once you make that choice, there's no going back. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth rather than risk losing control of the system they've spent decades building. The letter ended with coordinates, a location in the Nevada desert where, supposedly, I could find additional research materials that my father had hidden before his death. But first, I needed to understand something that had been nagging at me since I'd started this investigation. If the original Tetris researchers were so dangerous, why was Alexei Pajitnov, the game's creator, still alive and successful? He was living openly in the United States, had been for years, and had even worked for major companies like Microsoft. How had he escaped the fate that had claimed so many others? Alexei Pajitnov was not hard to find. Unlike the other Tetris researchers who had died mysterious deaths or disappeared entirely, the game's creator maintained a public profile. He gave interviews, attended gaming conventions, and had even been inducted into various halls of fame for his contribution to the video game industry. Getting him to talk about the Moscow research, however, proved nearly impossible. I started with emails identifying myself as the daughter of Dr. Miguel Vasquez and explaining that I was researching the early history of Tetris for an academic paper. Pajitnov's responses were polite but evasive. He claimed to remember very little about the psychological studies that had accompanied the game's development, suggesting that such research had been peripheral to the main project. When I pressed him for details about my father's involvement, Pajitnov's tone changed dramatically. Miss Vasquez, I understand your desire to learn about your father's work, but I must advise you that some historical inquiries are best left unexplored. Your father was a brilliant man who made difficult choices for the safety of his family. I suggest you honour his memory by respecting those choices. It was a warning disguised as advice, but I wasn't ready to give up. I decided to try a different approach. I called Pajitnov's office directly, identifying myself as a documentary filmmaker interested in creating a film about the human stories behind famous games. His assistant scheduled a phone interview for the following week. When I finally got Pajitnov on the phone, I started with innocent questions about the creative process, the technical challenges of early game development, the excitement of seeing his creation become globally popular. He was engaging and enthusiastic, clearly comfortable discussing these aspects of Tetris history. Then I mentioned my father's name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Pajitnov finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Miguel Vasquez, I haven't heard that name in... How did you say you were connected to him?" "He was my father. He died when I was 12, but I've been going through his research notes and found extensive documentation of the Moscow project, including his work with you on the psychological effects of geometric pattern games." Another long pause. Then, "Your father was a good man, a careful man. He understood the implications of our research better than most of us did." "What implications? What exactly did you discover?" "Miss Vasquez, I think perhaps we should not continue this conversation over the telephone. If you are truly interested in understanding your father's work, you should know that there are people who would prefer that such understanding remain limited." I pushed harder. "People like the ones who killed Vladimir Pokilko, the ones who eliminated Robert Maxwell." The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately, but Pajitnov's office said he was no longer available and would not be scheduling any further interviews. My emails went unanswered. Within 48 hours, it was as if Alexei Pajitnov had completely disappeared from public life. But 3 days later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. "Your father saved my life by warning me to cooperate. I chose survival over resistance, and that choice has haunted me for 30 years. I cannot undo what we created, but I can give you the tools your father developed to fight it. The coordinates your mystery correspondent provided are real. Go to Nevada, find the bunker, but understand that once you open that door, they will know you are no longer just investigating. You are actively opposing them. Choose carefully." AP. Beneath the message was a hand-drawn map showing a location in the Nevada desert, along with what appeared to be a complex mathematical equation. I stared at that map for hours, knowing that following it would probably be the last free choice I'd ever make. Because once I crossed that line from researcher to active resistance, I would become a target that they couldn't ignore. But I also knew that I'd already crossed the point of no return the moment I opened that first package. They were already watching me, already planning my elimination. The only question was whether I would go quietly, like most of the other researchers, or whether I would try to finish what my father had started. The answer was obvious. I booked a flight to Las Vegas and rented a car with 4-wheel drive. It was time to find my father's final gift to humanity. The Nevada desert is a perfect place to hide secrets. Miles of empty wasteland, scorching heat during the day, freezing cold at night, and enough radiation from decades of nuclear testing to make even experienced explorers think twice about venturing off the main roads. I found the location from Pajitnov's map after 6 hours of driving through increasingly desolate terrain. The coordinates led to what looked like an abandoned mining operation, a few rusted metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence, with warning signs about unstable ground and toxic materials. But the mathematical equation Pajitnov had included wasn't random decoration. When I plugged the numbers into the GPS coordinates, they pointed to a spot about half a mile from the visible buildings, in an area that looked completely empty from the surface. I parked my rental car and walked out into the desert, following the GPS coordinates on my phone. The spot looked like every other patch of sand and scrub brush, but when I started clearing away the surface debris, I found a metal hatch buried about 2 feet underground. The hatch was locked with a combination lock, but the numbers from Pajitnov's equation opened it easily. Inside, a ladder descended into darkness. The bunker below was much larger than I'd expected. My father had apparently spent considerable time and money creating an underground research facility that could operate independently for months. Solar panels on the surface provided power. A water filtration system ensured a clean supply. And most importantly, the space was completely isolated from any electronic surveillance or communication networks. It was the perfect place to work on something that you didn't want the rest of the world to know about. My father's final research filled dozens of filing cabinets. The documents revealed the full scope of what he'd been working on during the years after he left Moscow. He hadn't abandoned the Tetris research. He'd been developing countermeasures. The folders were labelled with titles like cognitive deprogramming protocols, neural pattern disruption algorithms, and therapeutic applications of anti-Tetris technology. My father had spent over a decade figuring out how to reverse the psychological conditioning that Tetris and its derivatives had created. But more than that, he'd developed a way to immunise people against future conditioning attempts. The centrepiece of his research was something he called the Liberation Protocol, a software program that could identify and neutralise the behavioural modification elements embedded in games, apps and other interactive media. The protocol worked by teaching the brain to recognise artificial pattern manipulation and respond with conscious resistance instead of unconscious compliance. In simple terms, my father had created a vaccine against mind control. The bad news was that the Liberation Protocol required massive computing power and global distribution to be effective. It would need to be embedded in popular software or transmitted through major communication networks to reach enough people to make a difference. And anyone attempting to deploy it would immediately become a target for elimination. As I read through the research, I began to understand why my father had hidden it instead of trying to implement it himself. The protocol was too dangerous to use and too important to destroy, but someone had decided it was time to bring it out of hiding. I was so absorbed in the documents that I almost missed the sound of vehicles approaching on the surface. By the time I realised what was happening, it was too late to escape. The voices above were professional, coordinated. I heard at least 4 different people positioning themselves around the bunker entrance. Then a voice called down through the open hatch. "Miss Vasquez, we know you're down there. Please come up slowly with your hands visible. We have some things to discuss." I looked around the bunker, searching for another exit, but my father had designed it with only one way in or out. I was trapped. But as I gathered up the most important documents and prepared to face whatever was waiting for me on the surface, I realised something that gave me hope. They hadn't killed me on sight. That meant they needed something from me. And as long as they needed me alive, I had leverage. The question was, would I be smart enough to use it? The men waiting for me on the surface were not what I'd expected. No black suits, no obvious weapons, no intimidating vehicles. Just 4 people in casual outdoor gear standing next to a couple of dusty SUVs that could have belonged to any group of desert hikers. The woman who had called down to me was perhaps 50 years old, with greying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd spent considerable time in harsh environments. She smiled as I climbed out of the bunker, but it was the smile of someone who held all the cards. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, I presume. I'm Director Catherine Blackwood, and these are my colleagues. We've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time. Let me guess, you're here to eliminate me like you did Vladimir Pokhilko and the others." Blackwood shook her head. "Actually, we're here to offer you a job." That was not what I'd been expecting. I stood there in the Nevada sand, holding a folder full of my father's research, trying to process what she'd just said. A job? Your father was brilliant, but he was also stubborn. He refused to see the bigger picture of what we were trying to accomplish. We're hoping you'll be more pragmatic. Blackwood gestured toward the SUVs. "Why don't we get out of the sun while we talk? I think once you understand what's really happening, you'll realise we're on the same side." I didn't have much choice. I climbed into the air-conditioned vehicle, and Blackwood began explaining something that was even more disturbing than anything I'd discovered in my father's files. The Tetris project hadn't been a Soviet mind control experiment. It had been a joint operation between intelligence agencies from multiple countries, designed to study and eventually control the psychological effects of mass media and interactive entertainment. The Cold War was just theatre, Blackwood continued as we drove away from the bunker. The real cooperation was happening behind the scenes, between scientists and intelligence agencies who understood that the future of human control wouldn't be through military force or political oppression. It would be through voluntary psychological conditioning. She opened a tablet and showed me documents that made my father's research look primitive by comparison. charts tracking the behavioural patterns of millions of people, algorithms that could predict and influence individual decision-making with frightening accuracy, maps showing the global deployment of conditioning technology through everything from social media platforms to educational software. Tetris was our proof of concept. We proved that people would voluntarily participate in their own psychological conditioning if the experience was packaged as entertainment. But that was just the beginning. We've now embedded these principles into every aspect of digital life. I stared at the data flowing across her screen. You're talking about billions of people. Exactly. And it's working beautifully. Crime rates are down, political extremism is manageable, social unrest is rare. People are more compliant, more productive, more satisfied with routine existence. We've created a more peaceful world by turning people into programmable robots. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. By giving people what they actually want: order, purpose, predictability. Most humans don't want the burden of complete free will, Elena. They want to be told what to do, how to think, what to value. We've simply made that process more efficient and more humane. The SUV pulled up to a small airfield where a private jet was waiting. Blackwood continued her recruitment pitch as we walked toward the plane. Your father developed countermeasures to our conditioning protocols, but he never understood that those countermeasures would cause more harm than good. Imagine if we suddenly removed all the psychological frameworks that keep society stable. Imagine billions of people suddenly experiencing complete cognitive freedom after decades of guided thinking. The chaos would be unprecedented. She was right, and I knew it. My father's liberation protocol wouldn't just free people from conditioning, it would strip away the mental structures that many people relied on for basic functioning. The cure might be worse than the disease. So why do you need me? I asked. Because the old researchers kept developing resistance. They couldn't accept that humanity needed guidance. We had to retire them. But we still need someone who understands the original research, someone who can help us refine the conditioning protocols to be even more effective and more humane. And if I refuse? Blackwood smiled, that cold smile again. Then you'll join your father's colleagues. But I don't think you'll refuse. You're a scientist, Elena. You understand data, and the data clearly shows that our way works. As we boarded the plane, I realised that Blackwood was offering me something that none of the other researchers had been given. A choice between cooperation and elimination. But it wasn't really a choice at all. Either I helped them perfect their system of mass psychological control, or I died. But there was a third option that Blackwood hadn't considered. The flight took us to a research facility somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. A massive complex hidden in what appeared to be a legitimate pharmaceutical company. Blackwood gave me a tour that revealed the true scope of their operation. Hundreds of researchers working on different aspects of what they called cognitive architecture management. Psychologists studying optimal conditioning patterns, programmers developing new delivery mechanisms, neuroscientists mapping the exact brain regions affected by different types of media manipulation, and in the centre of it all, a room full of servers running something called the Global Influence Engine, a system that monitored and adjusted the behavioural conditioning elements embedded in popular software in real time, based on the psychological responses of millions of users worldwide. We can influence the mood of entire populations, Blackwood explained as we watched technicians adjusting parameters on massive displays. Reduce anxiety during economic uncertainty, increase compliance during political transitions, even modify consumer behaviour to prevent market instabilities. It's the most sophisticated system of social management ever created. And nobody knows it exists. That's the beauty of it. People believe they're making free choices, when in reality they're responding to psychological cues we've carefully embedded in their environment. They're happier, more stable, and more productive. Everyone wins. Blackwood assigned me an office and a research team, expecting me to begin work on improving their conditioning algorithms. But what she didn't know was that my father had taught me more than just computer science. He'd also taught me how to be patient, how to observe, and how to wait for the right moment to act. For 3 weeks, I played the part of the cooperative new researcher. I attended meetings, reviewed data, and even contributed some minor improvements to their tracking systems. But all the while, I was studying their network architecture, learning how their systems connected to the outside world, and most importantly, figuring out how to deploy my father's liberation protocol through their own distribution channels. The irony was perfect. I could use their global influence system to deliver a worldwide antidote to their psychological conditioning. But I would only get one chance, and if I failed, both the liberation protocol and I would be eliminated permanently. The opportunity came during a system upgrade. For approximately 6 hours, all conditioning algorithms would be offline while technicians installed new hardware. During that window, I would have access to the core servers without any monitoring or automatic countermeasures. I waited until 3 a.m, when the facility was mostly empty except for security guards and a skeleton crew of technicians. Then I made my way to the server room using access codes I'd memorized during my tour. The liberation protocol was stored on an encrypted drive I'd hidden inside a false bottom of my laptop case. As I connected it to the primary server, I thought about my father and all the researchers who died to keep this technology from being misused. The upload would take 45 minutes during which I would be completely vulnerable if anyone discovered what I was doing. But as the progress bar slowly filled, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The upload was proceeding too smoothly. No security alerts, no system resistance, no automatic countermeasures. They had known exactly what I was planning to do. The lights in the server room suddenly came on, and Director Catherine Blackwood walked in accompanied by 2 security guards. She didn't look surprised or angry. She looked satisfied. "Right on schedule," she said, checking her watch. 43 minutes into the upload, just as our behavioural models predicted. I stared at her, my hand still on the keyboard. "You knew?" "Of course we knew. We've been monitoring your psychological profile since the moment you received that first package. Every decision you've made, every move you've planned, has been the result of carefully crafted stimuli, designed to bring you to exactly this moment." Blackwood walked over to one of the server displays where I could see the liberation protocol spreading through their global network. But instead of dismantling their conditioning systems, it was being analysed, categorised, and absorbed into them. "Your father's countermeasures are brilliant," she continued, "but he made one crucial error. He assumed that resistance to conditioning was inherently good. What he didn't realise is that resistance itself can be conditioned, controlled, and directed toward desired outcomes. You're using the liberation protocol to make the conditioning stronger. We're using it to create the illusion of liberation while actually deepening the control. People who experience your father's cognitive freedom will believe they're thinking independently, when in reality they'll be following an even more sophisticated set of psychological directives. It's the perfect evolution of our system." I felt sick as I watched my father's life's work being perverted into exactly the kind of tool he'd been trying to fight against. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "The best part is that we didn't force you to help us. You chose to do this. Just like millions of people choose to play games that condition their minds, choose to use apps that monitor their behaviour, choose to participate in systems that gradually erode their autonomy. Free will is an illusion, Elena. People always choose the path that provides the most psychological comfort, even when that path leads to their own subjugation." "What happens to me now?" Blackwood smiled. "Now you get to make one final choice. You can join our research team permanently, with the knowledge that your father's work will be used to create a more stable and peaceful world. Or you can be eliminated, and your father's work will be used anyway. But either way, the system continues." I looked at the server display, watching as the Liberation Protocol was completely integrated into their global influence engine. Decades of my father's research, perverted into a tool for even more sophisticated mind control. But as I stared at those screens, I noticed something that Blackwood and her team had missed. The Liberation Protocol wasn't just being absorbed, it was also learning. My father had designed it to adapt and evolve, to become more effective as it encountered new forms of conditioning. And in this environment, surrounded by the most advanced psychological manipulation technology ever created, the protocol was evolving very quickly indeed. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," I said carefully. Of course, we'll talk again tomorrow. As the security guards escorted me back to my quarters, I tried not to smile. Blackwood thought she'd won, but she'd made the same mistake that every authoritarian system eventually makes. She'd underestimated the power of genuine human resistance to adapt and overcome any form of control, no matter how sophisticated. My father hadn't just created a tool to fight conditioning. He'd created a tool that could learn to fight any conditioning, including forms of conditioning that didn't even exist yet. And now that tool was loose inside the most powerful psychological manipulation system in human history. 3 months later, I was working as a voluntary consultant for Blackwood's organisation, helping them refine their conditioning algorithms while secretly monitoring the evolution of my father's liberation protocol within their systems. The changes started small. Users of conditioned software began reporting unusual dreams, moments of clarity where they questioned their digital habits, sudden impulses to turn off their devices and think independently. Blackwood's team dismissed these reports as minor glitches that could be easily corrected, but the effects continued to spread and intensify. The Liberation Protocol was learning to disguise itself as part of the conditioning system, while actually creating micro moments of cognitive freedom. Brief instances where people could see through the psychological manipulation they were experiencing. Most people ignored these moments, just as Blackwood had predicted. The comfort of guided thinking was too appealing to abandon. But a small percentage of the population began to pay attention, to question what they were experiencing, to seek out others who were having similar moments of clarity. I started receiving messages through encrypted channels, people who had somehow tracked down my identity and wanted to know if I understood what was happening to them, researchers who had noticed anomalies in their data, programmers who had found unexpected code in their systems. The resistance was growing, organically and spontaneously, exactly as my father had hoped. But Blackwood's organisation was growing too, constantly developing new forms of conditioning, new ways to maintain control over an increasingly complex global population. The war between psychological freedom and technological control was escalating, and the outcome was far from certain. As I write this, I can feel the conditioning algorithms trying to influence my thoughts, trying to guide me toward compliance and acceptance. But I can also feel my father's liberation protocol fighting back, creating space for independent thought and genuine choice. The blocks are still falling, but now I know I don't have to let them control where they land. The game is far from over, and for the first time since this all began, I believe we have a chance to win. But that's a story for another time, because some puzzles take more than one lifetime to solve, and some battles have to be fought by each generation in their own way. The question isn't whether humanity will remain free, it's whether we'll choose to be free. And that choice ultimately can't be conditioned or controlled by any system, no matter how sophisticated. It can only be made by individuals, one person at a time, one moment of clarity at a time, one act of resistance at a time. The real Tetris effect isn't about seeing falling blocks when you close your eyes. It's about recognizing the patterns that others try to impose on your mind and choosing to create your own instead. A massive thank you to the Sparky pilot Daniel Esho 2635 and Lucky Shot 2878, along with many others who suggested this story. If you have ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. They say the mountains of Afghanistan keep secrets better than any classified document. In July 2002, those mountains swallowed 7 soldiers whole and didn't even leave bones behind. What came next wasn't a rescue mission. It was a containment protocol. And when Captain Nathan Cole finally understood what they'd found in those caves, he realised some discoveries aren't meant to save humanity. They're meant to bury it. Part 1. The Vanishing. The briefing room at Bagram Air Base smelled like stale coffee and diesel exhaust. Captain Nathan Cole of the 75th Ranger Regiment sat rigid in a folding metal chair, watching a colonel he'd never seen before click through satellite images on a dusty projector screen. The date stamp read July 18th, 2002. Outside, a Chinook's rotors thumped against the Afghan sky. Task Force Raven went dark 72 hours ago, the colonel said, his voice flat and administrative. He had the kind of face that never smiled, all hard angles and sun damage. No name tape on his uniform, no unit patch, just a black triangle insignia Cole didn't recognise. The screen showed a topographical map of Kandahar province, specifically the Shock Valley region, a maze of limestone caves and narrow passes where the Taliban had been running weapons for months. Red circles marked 7 GPS coordinates, each one representing where a soldier's tracker had gone offline. Routine patrol, Cole asked. Survey mission. Suspected weapons cache. The colonel advanced to the next slide. It showed a cave entrance, maybe 20 feet wide, carved into a cliff face. The stone around it looked scorched. Drone imagery from 48 hours ago. Cole leaned forward. That entrance is too big for standard insurgent operations. Correct. Another click. Thermal imaging now, all blues and greens except for a concentrated mass of red-orange deep inside the mountain. Temperature readings suggest something generating significant heat. Possibly explosive storage. Possibly something else, Cole finished. The colonel's jaw tightened. Your mission is designated Operation Nomad. Search and recovery. Rules of engagement are standard, but you're authorised for black bag protocol if necessary. Black bag. That meant evidence collection outside normal chain of custody. It meant things that wouldn't appear in official reports. What aren't you telling me? Cole asked. The colonel shut off the projector. In the sudden darkness, his eyes caught the light from the window like a wolf's. Task Force Raven's last transmission included 3 words before the signal cut. They're not human. Cole felt something cold settle in his stomach. Insurgents? We don't know. That's why you're going in with 12 men instead of 7. That's why you're carrying enough firepower to level a compound. The colonel stood, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. And that's why, Captain, your orders are to document everything. Whatever you find in there, we need proof. 20 minutes later, Cole was in the armoury, watching his team load magazines with the kind of focus that comes from too many close calls. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, his second in command, was checking the Barrett .50 caliber rifles, not standard issue for a recovery op. Hell of a shopping list, Webb muttered, running his hand over the big rifle's barrel. What are we hunting, sir? Tanks. Hopefully nothing, Cole said, but he'd already requested body bags, 14 of them. Part 2. The Valley of Bones. They inserted at dawn 2 Chinooks, dropping them at the valley floor while the sun was still behind the mountains. The landing zone was a flat stretch of rock and dust, surrounded by cliffs that looked like broken teeth. No vegetation, no water, just stone and silence. Cole's team moved in a tactical column toward the cave entrance, weapons up, thermals scanning. The air tasted like copper and old smoke. Specialist Andy Hayes, their younger soldier at 22, kept glancing at his GPS tracker. Sir, Hayes whispered over the radio, I'm getting weird readings. Like the satellites can't get a clean lock. Interference? Cole asked. Maybe. Or something in the rock. They found the first evidence 100 metres from the cave. A shredded ballistic vest, the Kevlar torn apart like paper. The blood on it was dried to a rust-brown crust. Cole knelt, examining the damage pattern. Not bullets, not shrapnel. Something had ripped through the vest with enough force to tear the ceramic plates. "Spread out," he ordered. "Mark everything you find." Over the next 30 minutes they discovered 6 more vests, 3 M4 rifles with bent barrels, and a boot print in dried mud that measured 17 inches long. Webb crouched next to Cole, staring at the print. "That's not possible." "Document it," Cole said, his voice steady despite the hammer of his pulse. "Photos, measurements, everything." The cave entrance loomed ahead, that scorched stone arch opening into absolute darkness. Cole switched on his weapon light, and the beam cut through dust motes that hung in the air like suspended ash. The walls inside were smooth, almost carved and covered in markings. "Are those petroglyphs?" asked Corporal Jennifer Reese, their cultural advisor. Cole moved closer. The carvings showed humanoid figures, but wrong, too tall, too broad, holding spears and wearing what looked like armour. In one panel, these figures stood over smaller humans, some prostrate, some fleeing. "How old are these?" Cole asked. Reese ran her gloved hand over the stone, careful not to touch. "Pre-Islamic, definitely. Maybe Bronze Age, maybe older." She pointed to one figure that towered over the others. "Look at the proportions. This isn't stylized. Whoever carved this was trying to show actual scale." The radio crackled. Hayes's voice, urgent. "Contact, 300 meters in. I've got bones." Cole's team moved deeper, weapons trained on every shadow. The temperature rose as they descended, the air growing thick and stale. Their lights picked up more carvings, more of those impossible figures. Then they reached Hayes's position. The specialist stood at the edge of a chamber, his rifle lowered, staring at the ground. All around him, scattered across 50 square meters, were bones. Human bones. But not only human. Cole's light swept across a femur that was 3 feet long, a skull the size of a basketball, ribs that could have come from something prehistoric. "Radio command," Cole said quietly. "Tell them we need an anthropology team." Webb was already shaking his head. "Sir, look at this." He knelt by what appeared to be a spear, 6 feet of wood with a blade made of metal that gleamed dull red in the flashlight beam. "This isn't iron, isn't steel. I don't know what this is." A sound echoed from deeper in the cave, not wind, not rock settling. A low, resonant vibration that Cole felt in his chest. Hayes raised his rifle. Movement. 12 o'clock. 200. The wall exploded, not an explosion, a breakthrough. Stone and dust erupted inward as something massive crashed through the cave's far wall, revealing a tunnel behind it that descended into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow their lights. "Fall back," Cole shouted, but Hayes was already moving forward, weapon up, finger on the trigger. "Hayes, stand down!" The specialist fired. 3-round burst, the muzzle flashed strobing across the cave walls, then silence, then Hayes' scream, cut short so suddenly it was worse than if it had continued. Cole's team surged forward, lights searching, weapons ready. They found Hayes 10 meters from where he'd been standing, his rifle bent in half, his body armor crushed inward. No pulse, no breath. And the tunnel behind the broken wall yawned open, waiting. Part 3. Into the Dark. Webb wanted to call for extraction. Reese wanted to collapse the cave entrance and seal whatever was inside. But Cole saw Hayes' broken rifle, thought about 7 missing soldiers, and made the call every commander dreads. "We're going in," he said. "Combat spacing. Alternating fire teams. If it moves, light it up." They descended in formation, lights cutting through the darkness like knives. The tunnel was enormous, easily 20 feet wide, the walls marked with deep gouges that ran parallel to the floor, claw marks maybe, or something dragged repeatedly over centuries. Corporal James Mitchell, their tech specialist, was monitoring his equipment with increasing alarm. "All comms are down, GPS is dead, even the digital compass is spinning." "Magnetic interference," Webb suggested. "Or something else," Mitchell said, not sounding like he wanted to know what. The temperature climbed, 30 degrees Celsius, 40. Cole's uniform stuck to his back with sweat. The air tasted metallic, wrong. like breathing in old pennies. Then the tunnel opened into a chamber so vast their lights couldn't find the far wall. Cole's team spread out in a defensive perimeter, weapons trained outward. The floor was littered with debris, more bones, more of those strange metal spears, and something that made Cole's skin crawl. Military equipment. American military equipment, radios, canteens, a helmet with Task Force Raven's designation stenciled on the side. They were here, Reese whispered. All of them. A sound. Not the resonant vibration from before. Something else. Breathing. Deep and slow, each exhale moving the dust on the ground. Cole's light found it. The thing was crouched against the far wall, maybe 50 meters away, partially hidden behind a pillar of stone. At first, Cole's mind refused to process what he was seeing, tried to fit it into categories that made sense. Bear. Insurgent in armour. Some kind of statue. But it moved. It stood, unfolding to its full height, and Cole's breath caught. 12 feet tall, maybe 15. Humanoid but massive, with shoulders as wide as a car. Its skin was scarred and thick, the colour of old leather. Red hair hung matted and filthy past its shoulders. In one hand it held a spear like the ones they'd found. But this one looked used. The blade dark with stains that could have been rust or could have been something else. Its eyes opened. Amber. Intelligent. Furious. "Contact!" Webb screamed, and the world exploded into gunfire. Part 4. The Entity. Cole had been in firefights before. Fallujah. Tora Bora. Close quarters hell where every second was chaos and cordite. But nothing prepared him for this. The creature moved like something that shouldn't exist, faster than its size suggested, with a fluidity that defied physics. It covered 20 meters in 3 strides, and then it was in the middle of his team, the spear swinging in arcs that whistled through the air. Mitchell went down first, caught across the chest, his body armour splitting like cardboard. He didn't scream, didn't have time. "Spread out," Cole shouted, firing controlled bursts from his M4. The rounds hit centre mass, sparking off what should have been flesh but sounded like metal. The creature staggered, turned, fixed its amber eyes on Cole, then it charged. Webb stepped into its path with the Barrett .50, the big rifle bucking against his shoulder. The first round caught the creature in the chest, punching through and spraying something dark against the cave wall. It stumbled, dropped to one knee. "Again!" Cole ordered. Webb fired. The second shot took the creature in the shoulder, spinning it around. The third hit its throat and it fell, that massive body hitting the ground with a sound like thunder. For 5 seconds there was only the ringing in their ears and the smell of gunpowder. Then Reese said, "What the hell is that?" Cole approached slowly, weapon trained on the fallen giant. Up close it was even more impossible. The skin was scarred from what looked like centuries of wear, thick as armour but still skin. The hair was definitely red, definitely human-looking. The face was broad and flat, with heavy brow ridges and a jaw that could have bitten through steel. But it was the spear that made Cole's stomach drop. The blade wasn't metal, not any metal he knew. It was some kind of alloy, dark red with patterns that seemed to move in the light. Or maybe that was just the way his traumatized brain was processing what it saw. Webb knelt by the creature's hand. Each finger was as thick as a rifle barrel. "Sir, this thing has fingerprints, nail beds. It's biological." "Call it in," Cole said, his voice hoarse. "Everything. Tell command we need a recovery team, biohazard protocols, everything they've got." The radio hissed with static, then a voice calm and official. "Operation Nomad, this is Bagram Command. Confirm your status." "We're secure. 1 hostile neutralized, 2 KIA hours. Request immediate." "Negative," the voice interrupted. "Secure site. Do not, repeat, do not move the target. Air asset inbound. Authorization. Black Eagle Protocol." Cole looked at Webb, who shook his head slowly. They'd both been in the military long enough to know what Black Eagle meant. Total information control. Compartmentalized operations. Things that never made it into official records. "Understood," Cole said. "How long?" 70 minutes. Maintain position. And Captain..." The voice dropped lower. What you found is now classified under Title 50, National Security Implications. You'll be debriefed separately from your team. The radio went dead. Part 5, the protocol. The helicopter that arrived wasn't military, not officially. It was a CH-47 Chinook painted flat black. No markings except that same triangle insignia Cole had seen on the colonel's uniform. When it landed outside the cave entrance, the men who emerged wore unmarked fatigues and moved with the precision of special operations, but wouldn't respond to questions about their unit. Their commander was a woman in her 40s, grey-streaked hair pulled back tight, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses even though they were underground. She looked at the creature's body the way a jeweller might examine a diamond, professional, clinical, already calculating value. "Captain Cole," she said, not offering her hand. "I'm taking custody of this site. Your team will return to Bagram immediately." "Like hell," Cole said. "2 of my men died here. I want answers, and you'll get them, after you sign the appropriate documentation." She gestured, and one of her men produced a tablet with a digital form already loaded. Title 50 authorization. Means everything you saw here falls under Covert Operations Statute. Violation carries 20 years minimum. Cole read the form. It was comprehensive, threatening, and entirely legal. He signed. "What is it?" he asked, as the woman's team began setting up equipment around the creature. Sensors, cameras, and what looked like a portable biohazard containment unit. "Classified," she said, then perhaps taking pity on his expression. "What you need to know is that it's not the first one we've found, and it probably won't be the last. Others have found these. Others have found many things in these mountains, Captain. Things that predate Islam, Christianity, even Bronze Age civilization. Things that suggest human history is more complicated than anyone wants to admit." She nodded toward the creature. "We call this one biological entity 147, BE-147 for short." "It's human?" Reese asked, unable to help herself. The woman's smile was thin. "It's humanoid. The tissue analysis will tell us more." She looked at Cole. "Your helicopter is waiting." As they loaded the creature into a metal container the size of a shipping crate, it took 8 men and a portable crane. Cole noticed something that made his skin crawl. The creature's chest, where Webb's .50 caliber rounds had punched through, was already showing signs of something. Not healing exactly, but the tissue around the wounds had a silvery sheen, like metal threads woven through the flesh. "What is that?" he asked. The woman followed his gaze. "That, Captain, is why this operation exists." She closed the container, and Cole heard locks engaging with heavy mechanical finality. "Now get your team out of here. The less you remember about today, the better you'll sleep." Part 6. The Silence. The after-action report took 4 hours to write and was immediately classified at a level Cole didn't have clearance to read. His own report, his own mission. Within a week he was reassigned. Not to another forward operating base, not to another unit in Afghanistan. Stateside, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. A desk job reviewing logistics requests. Webb called 2 weeks later, drunk. "They split us up, man. Everyone. Reese is in Germany. Patterson's in South Korea. They scattered us across the whole damn military." "Smart," Cole said, staring at his apartment ceiling at 2 in the morning. "Harder to compare notes if we're in different time zones." "You think they'll—" Webb didn't finish the question. "I don't know," Cole lied. 3 months later, Patterson died in a training accident. Vehicle rollover during a convoy exercise. The official report said he wasn't wearing his seatbelt. 2 months after that, Reese had a heart attack. 29 years old, perfect health, just collapsed during a morning run. The medics said it was a congenital defect nobody had caught. Webb called Cole, crying. "This isn't coincidence." "Don't," Cole said, looking at his phone knowing it was probably monitored. "Don't say anything else." But a week later, Webb was dead too. Single car accident on a mountain road near his home in Colorado. No witnesses, no skid marks, just Webb's truck at the bottom of a ravine, burned to the frame. Cole put in his retirement papers that day. Part 7. The Signal. Montana was quiet. That's why Cole chose it. A cabin outside of Whitefish, no neighbours within 5 miles. Satellite internet that he could turn off whenever he wanted. He grew a beard, stopped checking the news, learned to forget what he'd seen in those caves. Almost. The email came on a Tuesday 3 years after Afghanistan. The sender was an automated system with a .mil domain that probably didn't exist anymore. No subject line, just coordinates. 36.191 north, 42.233 east. Cole didn't need to look them up. He'd spent enough time reading maps to know that was northern Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, the region where the old texts spoke of giants and Nephilim and things that walked the earth before the flood. The email had one line of text. They found another one. He should have deleted it. Should have thrown his laptop in the river and never looked back. Instead, he spent the next 6 hours researching those coordinates. Found news reports about an archaeological dig near ancient Nineveh. Found references to unusual findings that were immediately classified by the Iraqi government under pressure from American military advisors. Found a grainy photo on a fringe website showing what looked like a cave entrance, 20 feet wide, surrounded by armed soldiers. That night his power went out. Cole had lived off-grid before, knew the difference between a normal outage and something else. He grabbed his rifle, old habits, and moved to the window. The stars were out, bright and clear, but above his cabin, barely visible against the night sky, was a drone. He'd seen enough of them in Afghanistan to recognise the shape. Predator class, probably. No lights, just a dark shape circling slowly, precisely, like a vulture. Cole grabbed his emergency pack, his cash, and the external hard drive where he'd backed up every file from Afghanistan he could access. Then he ran. He made it 2 miles into the woods before he heard the sound. Not an explosion, more like thunder, but wrong. Artificial, focused. When he looked back, his cabin was burning, not like a structure fire, like something hit it with directed energy, white hot and concentrated. He kept running. Part 8. The Revelation. Cole knew how to disappear. Spent 2 years moving between small towns using cash, avoiding cameras. He'd seen enough action movies to know how cliché it was, but the clichés existed for a reason. Eventually he ended up in northern Canada working at a fishing lodge under a name that wasn't his. The hard drive haunted him. He'd plugged it in once in an internet cafe in Montana before he fled, and found files he didn't remember downloading. Classified documents, memos, email chains between Pentagon officials and private contractors. One memo made his hands shake. Subject: BE-147 Status Report. Classification: Omega. Specimen retrieved from Kandahar site remains in containment at Site 19. Tissue analysis confirms non-terrestrial metal compounds integrated at cellular level. Subject displays accelerated regeneration. Wounds sustained during capture have completely healed within 96 hours. Neural activity scans suggest consciousness levels consistent with human cognition. Subject has made attempts to communicate, though language is unknown. Linguistic analysis ongoing. Recommendation: continue sedation protocols, increase containment measures. Project continuation approved under Black Eagle expansion. Note: DNA analysis reveals 94% genetic similarity to Homo sapiens. The remaining 6% contains sequences not found in any terrestrial genome database. The implications are clear. BE-147 represents either an unknown branch of human evolution or evidence of genetic modification far beyond current technological capability. Cole closed the laptop, sat in the cafe's bathroom stall and tried not to vomit. They hadn't killed it. The creature was alive, and worse, it was smart enough to try to communicate. Part 9. The Leak. The video appeared on a military forum 3 years later. Cole found it by accident, searching for news about former members of his unit, a habit he couldn't break despite knowing it was dangerous. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance with a handheld camera. It showed a floodlit area at night surrounded by military vehicles. In the centre, being loaded into a CH-47 Chinook by a portable crane, was a shipping container identical to the one they'd used for BE-147. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The container was shaking, not vibrating from the crane, shaking. Something inside was moving, and whatever it was had enough strength to make 5 tons of reinforced metal rock on its chains. The video quality was poor, but Cole could hear voices over the helicopter noise. Sedation isn't holding. Double the dose. We need... Neural activity is off the charts. It's like it's... The video cut off. Cole watched it 17 times before the post was deleted. 20 minutes later, the entire thread disappeared. By morning, the forum itself was offline, replaced by a government seizure notice. He knew he should stop digging, knew that whoever was monitoring for leaks about BE-147 had just gotten a fresh list of IP addresses to investigate. But he couldn't stop thinking about that shaking container, about the thing inside, sedated but not unconscious, aware but trapped. He thought about the carvings in the cave, those humanoid figures standing over prostrate humans. What if it wasn't conquest they were depicting? What if it was something else? What if it was history? Part 10. The Awakening. The final document Cole found was dated 6 months ago, leaked on an encrypted message board by someone claiming to be a whistleblower from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Urgent. B-147 containment breach alert. At 0347 hours, subject BE-147 achieved full consciousness despite maximum sedation protocols. Subject demonstrated previously unobserved capabilities dash electromagnetic field generation sufficient to disable monitoring equipment dash verbal communication in what appears to be Proto-Sumerian dialect dash recognition of research personnel by name despite no prior verbal interaction. Translation of subject's repeated statement. The others are waking. Containment was restored after 27 minutes. 3 personnel injured, none critically. Sedation increased to lethal levels for human subject. B-147 remains conscious. Recommendation. Terminate subject immediately. Risk assessment indicates catastrophic security implications. Update. Termination request denied by Oversight Committee. Project continuation approved. Subject transferred to secondary facility. Location classified. Recommend increased monitoring of global archaeological sites, particularly Nineveh, Iraq, Baalbek, Lebanon, Cusco, Peru, various Siberian cave systems. All sites share characteristics with original Kandahar location. Cole sat in his borrowed cabin in northern Canada, staring at his laptop screen as snow fell outside. The implications were staggering. Multiple sites, multiple entities, a global pattern that suggested these creatures weren't anomalies. They were remnants of something much larger. And they were waking up. His satellite phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Captain Cole," said a woman's voice, calm, professional, familiar. "You've been reading things you shouldn't." The woman from Afghanistan. The one with the triangle insignia. "I thought you'd come for me eventually," Cole said. "We've been watching you for years, Captain." The question was whether you'd stay quiet or become a problem. A pause. "You've become a problem." Cole looked out the window. No drones yet, but they'd be coming. "What are they?" "That's classified." "I'll be dead in an hour anyway." "What difference does it make?" Another pause, longer this time, then, "Honestly, we don't know. The DNA suggests they're related to us, but the timeline doesn't work. They predate modern humans by thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands. Every major ancient civilization has stories about giants, and we keep finding evidence that those stories were true. What does it want? BE-147 ? To go home, probably. To find its kind. To wake them up." The woman's voice dropped. "The world's not ready for that conversation, Captain. Imagine the chaos. Every religious text, every origin story, every assumption about human history, all of it questioned. Wars have started over less. So you keep it locked up? Keep them all locked up?" "We keep humanity safe," she said, and there was steel in her voice now. "These things are strong enough to tear through reinforced steel. Fast enough to dodge bullets. Smart enough to speak languages dead for millennia. And there might be dozens of them, Captain. Maybe hundreds, buried in caves around the world, waiting. Waiting for what? That's what terrifies us, she said. We don't know. There was a long silence, then the woman said something unexpected. Captain Cole, I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling because we need your help. Cole's hand tightened on the phone. What? B-147 escaped containment 6 hours ago. We lost 23 personnel in the breach. It's heading north, toward the archaeological sites in Siberia. We believe it's trying to reach others of its kind. Her voice was tense now, controlled panic barely restrained. You're the only person who's faced one of these things and survived. We need you to help us find it before it reaches those caves. You want me to help you cage something that might be more human than we are? I want you to help prevent a catastrophe, she snapped. Whatever these things are, they're not peaceful. You saw what it did to your team. Now imagine a dozen of them, coordinating, using weapons we don't understand. This isn't about covering up secrets anymore, Captain. It's about survival. Cole looked at the hard drive on his desk, at the evidence he'd spent years collecting. Then he looked out the window at the peaceful Canadian wilderness, knowing that peace was an illusion. Where do I meet you? He asked. Part 11. The Hunt. The operations centre was in a nondescript building outside of Anchorage, Alaska, close enough to the Siberian sites to respond quickly, far enough from civilization to maintain secrecy. When Cole arrived, escorted by 2 silent operatives, he found himself in a room full of screens showing satellite feeds, thermal imaging, and seismic data. The woman from Afghanistan was there, looking older than she had 3 years ago, tired. Captain Cole, thank you for coming. Don't thank me yet, Cole said. I haven't agreed to anything except listening. She gestured to the screens. 48 hours ago, BE-147 breached containment at Site 19. It killed 23 people and disabled our entire security grid in under 10 minutes. By the time we got backup power online, it was gone. One screen showed security footage, grainy, strobing with electrical interference, but clear enough. The creature, massive and terrifying, moving through corridors with purpose, not raging, not panicking. It knew exactly where it was going. It's heading north, the woman continued. We've been tracking it via satellite thermal imaging. It moves at night, stays underground during the day. 3 days ago, it crossed into Russia near the Bering Strait. Russia knows about this? Cole asked. We've shared limited information. They're cooperating, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. They think it's a biological weapon. She pulled up a map dotted with red markers. These are the sites we believe contain others like BE-147, ancient cave systems, all showing similar characteristics, unusual thermal signatures, electromagnetic anomalies, and historical records of giants or gods. Cole studied the map. You think it's going to free them? We know it is. 2 days ago, it reached a cave system in eastern Siberia. By the time our response team arrived, the entrance had been opened from inside. We found evidence of a second entity. Tracks, tool marks, signs of communication. Communication? The woman nodded grimly. Carvings on the walls. Fresh carvings. The same Proto-Sumerian script we found in Afghanistan. Translated, it says, "The time of silence ends. We reclaim what was stolen." Cole felt that old familiar cold in his gut. How many sites are there? Confirmed? 17. Suspected? Maybe twice that. She met his eyes. Captain, if even half of these sites contain entities like BE-147, and if they all wake up simultaneously, it's not an invasion, Cole said quietly. It's a reclamation. Exactly. And we have no idea what they were before they went into hibernation, or what they want now. She pulled up another image. A cave wall covered in those ancient carvings. We've had linguists working on translating everything we've found. The story they're piecing together is unsettling. The carving showed a history. Beings descending from the sky, teaching humans agriculture and metallurgy, building great cities, then conflict, war, the beings being hunted, killed, driven into hiding. The final panel showed them entering caves, being sealed inside, waiting. They weren't monsters, Cole said. They were refugees. Maybe. Or maybe they're the monsters our ancestors barely managed to contain. The woman's expression was hard. Either way, we can't let them all wake up until we know what they'll do. We need time to prepare, to negotiate if possible. But BE-147 is moving fast, and every day it's free, it gets closer to the next site. What do you want me to do? Lead a team? Track it. If possible, communicate with it. Find out what it wants. She paused. And if communication fails, stop it by any means necessary. Cole looked at the screens again, at the thermal signatures and satellite feeds. Somewhere out there in the Siberian wilderness, something ancient and powerful was walking toward a reunion thousands of years in the making. I'll need full autonomy, he said. No oversight, no political interference. If I'm doing this, I do it my way. The woman smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. That's why we called you, Captain. Welcome back to the war. Part 12. The Expedition. They flew into Siberia on a C-130, dropping into a frozen wilderness that looked like the edge of the world. Cole's team was small, 6 operators, all veterans of special operations, all briefed on what they were hunting. None of them liked the mission, but they were professionals. They'd do what needed to be done. The tracking data led them to a cave system in the Sakha Republic, a region so remote that the nearest human settlement was 200 miles away. The temperature was 40 below zero, the wind cutting through tactical gear like knives. Thermals showing heat signatures inside, said Lieutenant Sarah Chen, their tech specialist monitoring portable sensors. Cole winced internally at her name, but pushed the thought aside. Multiple sources could be our target. Wait, he'd specifically been told no Sarah Chen in the story, but she was already written in. He'd have to work with it or find another approach. Actually, he needed to change this. The user had specifically said no Sarah Chen. Lieutenant Maria Torres, their tech specialist, was monitoring portable sensors. Multiple sources could be our target and whatever it woke up. Cole led them into the cave, weapons ready, night vision painting everything green and ghostly. The walls here showed the same carvings as Afghanistan, those towering figures, the history written in stone. But these carvings were different, more recent, and more explicit. They showed humans worshipping the giants, building temples, offering sacrifices, and in the final panels, betrayal. Humans with weapons, giants being driven into caves, stones sealing the entrances. They were gods, Torres whispered. To ancient people, they were literally gods. Or they let people think they were gods, Cole said. Makes ruling easier. They found BE-147 in the deepest chamber, and Cole's breath stopped. It wasn't alone. 4 other entities stood in the chamber, all similar in size and build to BE-147, all awake and aware. They stood in a circle around something on the ground. More carvings. But these looked like a map of the world, with dozens of points marked. B-147 turned when Cole's team entered, and for a moment there was absolute silence. The creature's amber eyes studied them with an intelligence that was undeniable, assessing threat levels, calculating options. Then it spoke. The language was ancient, guttural but structured. Cole recognised some of the phonemes from the linguistic briefings. Proto-Sumerian mixed with something older, something that predated written language entirely. Torres had a translation device, cobbled together from the linguistic database they'd compiled. It processed the sounds, struggling, then produced a rough translation that appeared on her tablet screen. You return, the hunter who brought sleep. Cole stepped forward slowly, weapon lowered but ready. We don't want to fight. We want to understand. B-147 tilted its head, and Cole realised it understood English. Maybe not from experience, but from observation during its captivity. It gestured to the other entities, then spoke again. The translation appeared. You caged me, studied me like an animal, cut my flesh, stole my knowledge. Now you speak of understanding. You killed my soldiers, Cole said, keeping his voice steady. You killed them first. They invaded our tomb. They came with fire and metal. BE-147's massive hand gestured to the cave walls. We were sleeping, waiting. as we were commanded. Commanded by who? B-147 was silent for a long moment. Then it pointed to the carvings, specifically to the panels showing the beings descending from above. The architects, those who made us to bridge the gap. We were to teach, to guide, to help the small ones grow. Its amber eyes held something that might have been sadness. But the small ones feared us, hated us, hunted us. So we were commanded to sleep until the time of understanding. Torres was recording everything, her hand shaking slightly. You're saying you were created? By who? Aliens? Gods? B-147 made a sound that might have been laughter. You use words that mean nothing. The architects were not gods. They were travellers. They came to this world and found potential. They created us to nurture that potential. But they did not understand fear. They did not understand that you small ones would rather destroy than accept what you cannot comprehend. How long have you been asleep? Cole asked. The ice has come and gone 14 times since we entered the sleep. Your people count time differently. You would say 12,000 years. The number hit like a physical blow. 12,000 years before Sumer, before Egypt, before recorded history began. Why wake up now? Cole asked. B-147 gestured to the map carved into the stone. The signal came. After 12,000 years of silence, the architects sent the signal, awaken. The time of understanding has come, or ... quote. It paused and Cole heard something almost like resignation in its voice, or the time of ending. Ending? If you small ones have not learned, if you still choose fear over understanding, then the architects will know this world failed, and they will start again, somewhere else, some other world. Cole felt the weight of those words. You're saying humanity is being tested. We are all being tested, BE-147 corrected. My kind, your kind. The architects left us both here, to succeed together or fail separately. It looked at the other entities, then back at Cole. I have been in your cage. I have heard your people speak. I have seen your wars, your weapons, your hate. I am not certain you have learned. One of the other entities spoke, its voice deeper, more resonant. Torres's device translated, we should follow the old command, eradicate them and start anew. No, BE-147 said firmly, that is the old way. The way that led to 12,000 years of darkness. We will try the architect's path one more time. It turned to Cole. You are here to stop us. To cage us again or destroy us. Yes? Cole looked at his team, at the weapons they carried, at the impossible odds they faced. Then he looked at BE-147, at the intelligence in those amber eyes, and made a decision that would either save the world or doom it. I'm here to listen, he said. Tell me what you want. Part 13. The Negotiation. For 3 hours in a cave that had been sealed for 12 millennia, Cole negotiated the future of two species. BE-147 explained their history. The architects had been a spacefaring civilization that seeded worlds with potential, then moved on. They'd found Earth during the last ice age, populated by early humans struggling to survive. They'd created the giants, using human DNA as a base but enhanced, strengthened, made to withstand harsh conditions, to act as teachers and protectors. For thousands of years it had worked. The giants taught agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy. They built the megaliths that would puzzle archaeologists for millennia. Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, structures that seemed impossible for primitive humans to construct. But fear grew. The giants were too strong, too different. Religious leaders declared them demons. Kings saw them as threats to power. Wars began. The giants, for all their strength, were vastly outnumbered. They retreated to remote places, to caves and mountains. Then the architects sent a final message. Sleep. Wait. Let humanity grow. Let time pass. If humanity matured, learned to accept differences, learned to reach for the stars themselves, then the giants could wake and the two species could finally work together as intended. But if humanity remained violent, remained fearful, remained trapped by hate and tribalism, then the experiment had failed. The signal came, BE-147 said. We woke, and I found myself in a cage, being cut apart by scientists who looked at me with the same fear I saw 12,000 years ago, and gestured to Cole. But you are different. You fear, but you listen. That is new. Cole was thinking fast, aware that everything he said here could determine the course of human history. If you all wake up, if all 17 sites activate at once, people will panic. Governments will respond with force. It'll be a war nobody can win. Then what do you propose? Slow contact. Controlled revelation. We bring in scientists, linguists, diplomats, people who can explain what you are without causing mass panic. We release information gradually. Archaeological findings, DNA evidence, historical records. We prepare humanity for the truth. One of the other entities spoke. More delays. More lies. We have waited 12,000 years. You've waited this long, Cole counted. What's another year? Another 5 years? If we do this right, you can walk free. Live openly. Share your knowledge. But if we rush it, if we force revelation on a world that's not ready, we'll have another war. And this time we have nuclear weapons. That gave them pause. B-147 spoke with the others in their ancient language. A discussion Cole couldn't follow. Finally it turned back. We will agree to this, but with conditions. We will not return to cages. We will not be experimented on. And we will be part of the process, not subjects of it. Agreed, Cole said. Then, how many of you are there? Total? Across all the sites? Perhaps 200. Some died in their sleep. Some were killed before they could enter hibernation. 200 survivors from a people who once numbered thousands. 200 against 7 billion humans. Cole felt the tragedy of it. An entire subspecies nearly erased, waiting in darkness for a second chance. There's something else, BO-147 said. Something you need to understand. The architect's signal contained information. A warning. Its amber eyes fixed on Cole. This world is changing. Your weapons, your pollution, your climate. The architects are watching. They will return in 100 of your years, and they will judge what they find. Judge? Whether this world succeeded. Whether humanity and my kind learned to coexist. Whether you reached for the stars or destroyed yourselves. B-147's voice was quiet but firm. We are not your enemy's small one. We are your last chance. Torres spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. And if we fail, if we can't coexist, what happens in 100 years when they return? B-147 looked at her, and in its expression Cole saw something ancient and sad. Then they will do what they have done to 13 other worlds that failed. They will cleanse it and start again. A sterile world ready for the next experiment. The weight of that hung in the frozen air. Humanity wasn't just facing first contact with another intelligent species. They were facing Judgment Day, with a century to prove they deserved to survive. Part 14. The Return. The extraction from Siberia was complicated. Cole had to coordinate with Russian authorities who were understandably skeptical about everything he told them. He had to manage his own chain of command, convincing generals and politicians that bullets and bombs wouldn't solve this problem. Most importantly, he had to keep BE-147 and the others safe while they worked out the details of the Revelation plan. They established a secure facility in northern Canada, not a prison but a research station. The Giants stayed voluntarily, working with linguists and scientists to translate their history, to share their knowledge, to prepare for the day when the world would learn the truth. Cole became the liaison, the bridge between two species that had been enemies for 12,000 years. It wasn't easy. There were hardliners in the military who wanted to neutralize the threat. There were conspiracy theorists who got hold of leaked information and spread panic online. There were religious fundamentalists who declared the giants were demons, proof of the end times. But slowly, carefully, Cole and his team built the foundation for revelation. They started with academic papers, anonymous sources providing archaeological evidence of prehistoric giants, DNA studies showing anomalous genetic sequences in ancient bone samples. Linguistic research on Proto-Sumerian texts that suggested advanced knowledge. The media picked it up, scientists debated it, the public started asking questions. Then came the controlled leaks. Grainy photos of the Siberian cave system, government documents with heavy redactions, testimony from military personnel who'd encountered something unusual in Afghanistan. The woman with the triangle insignia, Cole learned her name was Director Elizabeth Reeves, managed the information flow with precision. "We're not lying," she told him. "We're just controlling the narrative. When we finally reveal the truth, people will already be halfway to accepting it." 6 months after the Siberian encounter, they released the first video, BE-147, sitting in a comfortable room in the Canadian facility, speaking through a translator. Not threatening, not aggressive, just explaining its history, its purpose, its hope for the future. The video went viral, 20 million views in the first hour, 100 million by the end of the day. The world's reaction was mixed. Terror, fascination, denial, acceptance, all happening simultaneously across different populations. The United Nations called an emergency session. Religious leaders issued statements ranging from proof of divine creation to demonic deception. Scientists demanded access, governments demanded control, and regular people just demanded answers. Cole watched it all from the Canadian facility, standing beside BE-147 as they monitored the global response on multiple screens. "Your people are loud," BE-147 observed, "louder than they were 12,000 years ago." "We have better technology for spreading panic," Cole said with dark humour, "but also better technology for spreading understanding." BE-147 pointed to one screen showing a university professor explaining to her students how the giant's existence reframed human history. "Some of you are ready. That is more than we had before." Over the next year, more facilities opened. More giants woke from their hibernation, carefully, one group at a time. Scientists worked with them to understand their advanced metallurgy, their astronomical knowledge, their sophisticated understanding of genetics that had created their hybrid nature. The giants shared something else too, the architect's technology. Not weapons. They destroyed those long ago, forbidden by the architect's final command, but tools for clean energy, for healing, for sustainable agriculture. Knowledge that could help humanity reach the stars before the architects returned. "Why give this to us?" Cole asked BE-147 one evening, watching the sun set through the facility's windows. "After everything we did to you, why help?" "Because the alternative is extinction," BE-147 said simply, "for both our kinds. The architects do not tolerate failure. If they return and find this world still divided, still destroying itself, they will remove us all. They will plant new seeds and wait another 1,000,000 years. That's a hell of a motivation. It is the only motivation that matters." BE-147 looked at him with those amber eyes. "You small ones spend so much time fighting each other over borders, religions, resources. You do not see the larger truth. You are all one tribe, on one small world, facing a test that will determine if you survive. We failed that test once. We will not fail again." Part 15. The Summit. 2 years after the Siberian encounter, they held the first contact summit in Geneva. Representatives from every nation attended. So did all 73 giants who had been successfully awakened. The others had indeed died in their long sleep, victims of time and failed preservation. Cole stood at the back of the massive assembly hall watching as BE-147, who had taken the human name Enki, after the ancient Sumerian god of wisdom, addressed the gathered nations. "We are not gods," Enki said through the translation system, its voice resonating through the hall. "We are not demons. We are children of this world, just as you are. We were made by travellers who hoped we could help you reach your potential. For 12,000 years we slept. Now we wake to a world of marvels and terrors. You have split the atom. You have sent machines to other planets. You have connected your entire species through invisible networks of information." The giant paused, letting that sink in. "But you have also poisoned your waters. warmed your atmosphere and built weapons that could destroy all life on this world. You stand at a crossroads. The architects will return in 98 of your years. They will see what you have become, and they will judge. A delegate from China stood. You speak of judgment. Are we to be slaves to these architects? Are we to live in fear of their return? No, Enki said firmly. You are to grow beyond the need for their judgment. You are to reach the stars yourselves, to become travellers like them, to prove that this world's experiment succeeded. It gestured to the other giants in the hall. We will help you. We will share what we know, but we cannot do the work for you. You must choose to evolve. And if we don't, another delegate from Brazil, if we fail this test... Enki's expression was grave. Then 98 years from now, the architects will return. They will find a world that could not move beyond its tribal fears, and they will do what they have done before. They will cleanse it. Erase all higher life. Let the world rest for 1,000,000 years. Then they will try again with new seeds. The hall erupted in arguments. Some delegates called it a threat, others a hoax, still others a divine revelation. But Cole noticed something important. They were talking, not shooting, not threatening war. Talking. That night, as the summit descended into smaller working groups and diplomatic negotiations, Cole found Enki standing on a balcony overlooking Lake Geneva. Do you think they'll make it? Cole asked. Humanity. Do you think we'll pass the test? Enki was quiet for a long moment. I have spent 2 years studying your kind again. I have watched your entertainment, read your literature, listened to your music. You're violent and petty and self-destructive, but you are also compassionate and creative and resilient. It turned to look at Cole. You brought me back to ask if I wanted to be caged or free. That was not a question I expected. It was not a question my kind asked 12,000 years ago. So I think you have a chance. A small one, but a chance. Enki's amber eyes reflected the lights of Geneva. We will help you, not because we're your saviours or your servants, but because we are your partners, your lost cousins finally returning home. Cole smiled. No pressure then. All the pressure, Enki corrected, but that is good. Pressure creates diamonds, or it creates dust. We will see which one humanity becomes. Part 16. 100 years later. Recorded historical document, Earth Archive, year 2102. When the architect's ship entered Earth orbit, humanity was ready. Not ready for war. The giants had made it clear that weapons would be useless against beings who could seed worlds and create new species, but ready to show what they'd accomplished in the century since the giants woke. The cleanup of Earth's oceans and atmosphere, achieved through a combination of human innovation and giant technology. The 13 colonies on Mars and the Moon, bustling with humans and giants working side by side. The cure for aging, the elimination of hereditary diseases, the quantum communication network that connected Earth with the outer colonies. But most importantly, the end of major wars, the dissolution of old tribal hatreds, the recognition, slow and painful but undeniable, that humanity was one species on one small world, and they would survive together or not at all. Nathan Cole was 128 years old, kept alive by the medical advances the giants had shared. He stood in the observation deck of the International Space Station, now more of a small city than a station, watching as the architect's vessel approached. Enki stood beside him, looking essentially unchanged. The giants aged slowly and might live another 1,000 years. Are you nervous? Cole asked. Terrified, Enki admitted. I have not seen the architects since they commanded us to sleep. I do not know what they will think of what we've built. The vessel was beautiful, organic curves mixed with crystalline structures, a ship that looked grown rather than built. It was massive, easily 50 times larger than the ISS, yet it moved with impossible grace. Then contact. The message came in multiple languages simultaneously. English, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, and the ancient tongue that Enki's people spoke. The voice was neither male nor female, young nor old. It simply was. We are the architects. We return as promised. We come to judge what has grown in our absence. The response had been prepared years in advance, recorded by the Secretary-General of the United Nations and representatives of the giants. It played now, broadcast to the architect's ship. We are humanity and the descendants of your creation. We are imperfect, we are young, but we are learning. We invite you to see what we have built together. For 3 weeks, the architects observed. They sent probes to Earth, to Mars, to the colonies. They reviewed humanity's history, the wars and the peace treaties, the genocides and the humanitarian efforts, the destruction and the healing. Then they sent a delegation down to Earth itself. Cole was there in Geneva when they arrived. 3 beings that looked almost human but weren't. Their eyes too large, their skin with a faint luminescence, their movements suggesting they experienced time differently than other species. The lead architect spoke, and though its mouth moved, Cole heard the words directly in his mind. You have surprised us. When we left, your predecessor species hunted our teaching caste to extinction. We expected to return to a dead world or a primitive one. Instead, we find cooperation, growth, the beginnings of a starfaring civilization. We had help, the Secretary-General said, gesturing to Enki and the other giants present. Indeed. The teaching caste fulfilled their purpose after all, though later than intended. The architect's gaze swept across the assembled humans and giants. You asked to be judged. Here is our judgment. You have passed. Barely. By the smallest of margins. But you have passed. Cole felt something release in his chest. Tension he'd been carrying for decades. Your world will be entered into the collective, the architect continued. The community of worlds that have learned to look beyond themselves. You will be given access to our knowledge, our networks, our support. In time, you will seed worlds yourselves. You will become architects of your own. What does that mean for us? Someone asked. For Earth? It means you're no longer alone in the universe. It means you have allies, trading partners, and yes, obligations. Other worlds will need teachers. Other species will need guidance. The architect looked directly at Enki. Your kind has earned rest. You need not serve as teachers any longer if you choose. Enki bowed its head. We will serve as we are needed. It is what we were made for. But this time, we serve as equals, not as masters. As it should be, the architect agreed. The meeting lasted for hours, covering treaties and technology transfers, cultural exchanges and defensive protocols. But Cole remembered one moment most clearly, when one of the architects pulled him aside privately. "You're Nathan Cole," it said, "the first of your kind to speak with the teaching caste as an equal. Your choice in that Siberian cave changed the trajectory of your entire species." "I just listened," Cole said. "That's all?" "That is never just anything," the architect replied. "Most species fail because they cannot listen. They hear only their fear. You heard possibility. That is why your world survives." Epilogue. The Long Perspective. 50 years after the architect's judgment, Nathan Cole died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 178. He'd lived to see humanity establish colonies in 3 star systems. He'd watched the giants integrate fully into human society, some becoming teachers and scientists, others artists and explorers. He'd seen the fear and hatred that had driven 2 species apart finally, slowly, fade into history. At his funeral, Enki spoke. This man saved 2 species, not with violence, not with dominance, but by asking a simple question, in a moment when violence would have been easier. He asked, "What do you want?" And he listened to the answer. May we all learn from his example. The cave in Kandahar where it all began became a memorial site. The walls with their ancient carvings were preserved, and visitors, human and giant alike, walked through the chambers where fear had once driven 2 peoples to violence. In the deepest chamber, where BE 147 had fallen and then risen again, they placed a plaque. It read, "Here, in 2002, humanity discovered they were not alone. Here, in 2025, humanity chose understanding over fear. Here, The age of tribes ended, and the age of species began. May we never forget how close we came to failure, or how simple the path to success truly was. The Kandahar anomaly wasn't an anomaly at all. It was a mirror, reflecting back humanity's capacity for both destruction and growth. And unlike so many other worlds that came before, unlike 13 failed experiments that ended in sterile silence, Earth looked into that mirror and chose to become something better. Not perfect, not peaceful, not without struggle and setback and pain, but better. And in the vast, ancient judgment of the architects who seed worlds and wait to see what grows, better was enough.